Good afternoon, Madam Secretary.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman.
Please begin.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon, everyone. This is the City Planning Commission Review Session. Today is Monday, June 15th, 2015, and a quorum is present. We'll begin with a presentation by staff of the Department of City Planning that will provide an overview of our proposed zoning text amendment that will promote affordable senior housing and care facilities, modernize rules that shape buildings, and reduce parking requirements for affordable housing.
Actually, just before Howard starts on this presentation, I'd just like to say a few words. This is a citywide proposal. It has, as members of the commission know, has not been certified yet. We've had a scoping session on it, and we have been going to communities around the city to explain it. The goal is to reduce the costs of constructing affordable and senior housing. Virtually all of that housing, as you know, is subsidized. So if we can reduce the costs of that housing, it would allow taxpayer dollars to go further, and we could build more affordable housing and more senior housing. And there's also a component of the study of this proposal to make contextual zones, as you will hear from Howard and others, even more contextual and attractive. The amendments would not allow 1 square foot more of market rate housing. This is all about affordable housing and senior housing. Nevertheless, as we've been going around the city, there has been quite a considerable amount of skepticism about the proposal. I think many people don't understand it. They think it is complex, and it's our obligation to make it as clear as possible. There are some who don't believe that these very modest changes will reduce the costs for affordable and senior housing. And then there are others who actually believe it will work and will increase affordable and senior housing, and they don't particularly want it in their neighborhoods. And some believe that this will lead to some sort of abrogation of height limits, which communities have fought for over many, many years, even though if height limits are increased at all, it will be very, very modest, in most cases 5 feet or so. And there are others who fear that this will eliminate parking requirements, even though the reductions would apply only for affordable housing and affordable senior housing in certain areas where we know from our research that the incidence of car ownership is basically tiny. So the purpose of today is to bring all of you up to date on what this proposal actually is at the moment, what it says, and hear your questions about it as we continue to go out and talk to communities throughout the city. So with that, I turn it over to Howard Slatkin.
Thank you. Morning, good afternoon, Commissioners. I don't know why I'm still in the morning. I'm actually just going to give a brief introduction, and the team that's been working on the project is going to walk through the various components. But I just want to continue to build on, I think, what Carl was talking about, which is how this proposal is an important part of Housing New York. Really, we've identified extraordinary needs for housing in the city, particularly at affordable housing for a variety of income levels. We know that it is often challenging to provide that, but we need to do a lot in order to deliver that housing. And so we've looked through the zoning. We've worked with a lot of the people who work with the zoning on the other side of the on the other side of the zoning resolution, who are actually the users of the zoning, and found the problems that they frequently encounter when they're trying to provide affordable housing, and have come up with what we think are a very targeted set of changes that would address some of these really important issues in a way that we think not only benefits affordability, but also speaks to one of the other key priorities of the housing plan, which is really supporting vibrant, livable, diverse neighborhoods that provide communities all around the city with neighborhoods that meet their needs and support their daily quality of life. This is one of several projects. This is sort of the clarifying slide. There are many things going on, of course, under the housing plan, and specifically at city planning. There are three major sets of things that we're doing right now. There are a series, of course, of neighborhood planning studies that are being undertaken in specific communities around the city where we think there are opportunities for mixed income housing that is planned as part of a comprehensive neighborhood-wide approach. There is also the development of a mandatory inclusionary housing program, which would be applied to future actions, including, for instance, rezonings emanating from the neighborhood planning studies. That is the subject of study by City Planning and HPD in particular, and we'll be coming back to the Commission with more on that. But this third category, zoning for quality and affordability, is really about making the zoning that exists in neighborhoods today work better to support our ability to complete the housing plan and to provide affordable housing within neighborhoods. The driving goals behind the proposal are, as Carl mentioned, to really address the cost issues, the barriers, the things that make it more costly, more difficult, more time-consuming, less competitive to build affordable housing than often other types of housing. And we found, interestingly, that some of the same issues are also issues that are discouraging better quality architecture, and we think that we can actually encourage better quality buildings. There's some very targeted changes to the contextual zoning regulations, which we'll go into in some more detail. And then there are some specific needs, in particular senior housing and care, which have long been privileged in the zoning, but really not in a way that's effectively produced the amount of senior housing and other senior facilities that we need around the city. And then finally, this is a theme that comes up frequently before the Commission, but the parking requirements associated with affordable housing and how they pose a unique challenge to the development of affordable housing, where you really don't have revenue to offset the cost of providing the parking, and you have a population that makes less use of that parking even when it is provided. So that is one of the really important cost considerations here. So the presentation flows in three main segments. We're going to first talk about the senior housing and care facilities, then about modifications to the contextual zoning regulations, and finally parking regulations. We'll start with Stacy, who will talk about the senior housing.
Right, good afternoon. So this section of the proposal is really aimed to look at how we can promote and encourage affordable senior housing and also senior long-term care facilities. We know that the population in New York City is aging. We're actually projecting that in the next 25 years, there will be a 40% increase to this demographic group, which is an additional 400,000 people. So because of this, we really want to make sure that we're encouraging this housing type. We know we need to supply a greater range of these types of housing units and also care facilities. And this is happening for two different reasons. One, we see people living longer. So the group of people who are over the age of 85 is increasing quite rapidly. They have certain care and housing needs that are very different from younger seniors who are in their early 60s, who can live more independently. So we've been taking a look at these housing types, and just to explain what we mean when we talk about affordable senior housing, this is really independent housing, but it's low income, so it's restricted by income, and it's also restricted by age. These tend to be smaller units, but also have larger common areas within the buildings. To produce this housing type, it really requires public subsidy. It doesn't really occur on its own. But it's become increasingly more difficult over the years to produce this housing type because we've lost federal sources, such as the HUD 202 program, which has been cut. And we estimate that there have been about 3,500 units of affordable senior housing produced in the last 10 years. But the de Blasio administration is proposing to build 5,000 in the next 10 years. So we know we really need to address this housing and look at ways to further promote it. We already today in the zoning resolution provide an additional amount of floor area to what's called the nonprofit residence for the elderly category. It's about 20% higher, but it only exists in certain zoning districts, and we also see a need to generally modernize and update this category. We're also looking at long-term care facilities. These are state regulated, so they're licensed with the Department of Health, and they provide, it can be beds or apartments, but they tend to be things like nursing homes, assisted living, and also continuing care retirement communities. They have a much higher level of care and are really typical kind of healthcare and housing facilities. We think, according to the Department of Health, there's actually a shortage of about 8,000 residential long-term care beds in New York City, which is a tremendous shortage. And unfortunately, the zoning today actually discourages these uses. It provides a lower floor area than we provide to other similar community facilities, and also a lower floor area than we're providing to the nonprofit residents for the elderly. We've also heard that today and moving forward, people would like to integrate and mix some of these uses. We've spoken with architects and advocates of these housing types. And while historically these tended to be more standalone uses, so you had a nursing home by itself or a HUD 202 project by itself, that increasingly people would like to mix them and also mix them with other housing types. So mixing affordable senior housing also with affordable housing. And right now, the zoning actually discourages that as well. So through this text amendment, we're hoping to make it easier. There are really 4 key pieces of our proposal when it relates to the affordable senior housing component. First, we're proposing to modernize the zoning definitions. So we have not updated these definitions since the 60s. And today we have the nonprofit residence for the elderly category. We're proposing to actually replace that with a broader term, affordable independent residence for seniors. This would allow a wider range of developers to actually produce this housing type, and we think that we'd end up seeing it in more places around the city. We're also proposing to replace what is the current term nursing homes and health-related facilities with a broader term, long-term care facilities. Today, there's not a definition in zoning for assisted living, for example, and this is really an important piece of the state and also our city's long-term care supply. So we'd really like to be able to address that. And we're also proposing, second, to rationalize the floor area ratios for these uses. Right now, as I mentioned earlier, we do allow a higher floor area for nonprofit residents for the elderly in certain districts. We don't allow that for some of the higher density districts. We're proposing to extend that 20% to those higher density districts above R6, and also to allow the long-term care facilities to have the same floor area that the nonprofit residents for the elderly or affordable independent residents for the elderly would have. So they would all have the same floor area, which works around the same framework of a 20% bonus. We're also proposing to revise the density restrictions that exist for this housing type. Today we have a minimum unit size, and we also have a density factor that applies. This makes it difficult for people to build what are units that are approved under some of their regulatory programs. So we're proposing to remove those density restrictions, which would allow a greater range of housing sizes to be produced. And finally, we have a special permit process, which you may be familiar with for the nursing home uses. We're actually proposing to remove this process, remove the certification and the special permit. This is redundant with a review that is done by the state through their licensing program. It really looks at the need for nursing home beds within a certain geography. This is something that is done while the state is reviewing and approving licenses as well. So it's really adding cost and time to the development of these projects. And often we see it applying really just to renovations. So it's impeding also the modernization of existing facilities. So I'm going to pass it off to Chris, who's going to talk about the next section.
Thanks, Stacy. Next, we have our proposed modifications to the rules that shape buildings, so what we call our building envelope, from controls. The proposal includes updates to rules that shape residential buildings in medium and high density areas of the city. Specifically, these are the R6 through R10 zoning districts and their commercial equivalents. Our contextual rules are intended to create buildings that reflect the general character of their surrounding neighborhoods. They require buildings close to the property line and have requirements for street walls and maximum building heights. These regulations are different in each zoning district, reflecting the varying densities permitted in them. They're required in contextual zoning districts, which are denoted through a letter suffix, such as an R6A. In those zoning districts without letter suffixes, these provisions are optional. These contextual zones were established in the 1980s to promote mid-rise housing that better fit within neighborhood fabric. We like these rules and have required them in many of our rezonings since then. However, since the 1980s, there have been a number of changes in residential building practices to which zoning has not kept pace. These include safety and building code changes like sprinklers and heightened ADA requirements, new residential construction methods, improvements to best practices for residential design, including higher floor-to-floor heights, and a greater degree of development taking place on irregularly shaped lots. To give some examples, our assumptions in 1987 were that floor-to-floor heights in residential buildings were approximately 8'8" floor-to-floor. This is not only lower than today's best practice standards of about 10-foot floor-to-floor, it's lower than much of our pre-war housing stock. The original provisions also assumed low ground floor heights that today make for poor quality ground floor retail or ground floor residential spaces. You can see on the drawing on the right that the residential units are fronting directly onto the sidewalk rather than being slightly elevated like the building on the left. By not keeping pace with those changes, rules in contextual zoning districts are currently making housing more expensive to construct while discouraging quality ground floor retail and residential spaces and encouraging boxy, flat buildings with undifferentiated facades. In buildings trying to accommodate inclusionary housing, these problems are heightened as the additional floor area associated with the program is currently forced to fit within the same height limits. Unfortunately, this has often deterred people from using the program despite the bonus floor area. Many of these issues were pointed out by the Citizens Housing Planning Council's recent study, The Building Envelope Conundrum. Our goal is to strengthen contextual zoning regulations with limited changes that help them better serve their original goal of contributing to the fabric of the neighborhoods where they're mapped. To do that, we've spoken with architects, housing advocates, builders, and our sister agency, HPD, to understand what are current best practices for residential building design and construction. We want to make sure our regulations allow for buildings that achieve this standard and can better match their surrounding neighborhood character, whether they're in a residence district or a commercial district, because as you can see, each has unique qualities that should be reflected in our regulations. To ensure best practices can be met requires modifications to building envelope controls in medium and high density contextual districts. This requires increasing maximum building heights by 5 feet in most zoning districts. In our highest density districts, 1 additional story would be needed. In addition to this, modifications to upper story setback requirements and corner lot rules would allow buildings that are more in keeping with their context and allow for more efficient construction. We're not proposing any increase in permitted FAR for market rate housing. Rather, these modifications will allow the existing FAR to be accommodated in better designed buildings that are constructed more efficiently. For developments with affordable housing for seniors or inclusionary housing, which are allowed additional floor area, we are proposing sufficient room to fit this housing. This would amount to 1 or 2 additional stories in most cases, and 3 to 4 in only the highest density districts where existing height limits severely limit the efficacy of these programs. Senior and inclusionary housing sites would also be granted other limited flexibility to construct their building in an efficient manner. The proposal also includes other updates to zoning regulations affecting the general design of medium and high density residential buildings in order to allow buildings to better reflect and even mimic the features of other buildings in many neighborhoods. This includes minor modifications to street wall, courts, ground floor, and unit size regulations. Finally, the proposal includes changes to address irregularly shaped lots, which are not well considered in the zoning resolution, as most regulations were crafted around a prototypical 100 by 100 foot lot. When these rules are applied to shallow lots, angled lots, or lots with irregular topography, there can be inadvertent consequences that often reduce efficiency and escalate construction costs. To address these, we're proposing special modifications to yards, lot coverage, and distance between building regulations. Next, Laura will present on the parking proposal.
Thank you, Chris. So the third and final component to the proposal deals with parking requirements for affordable housing and for affordable senior housing. First, we have found through study that it's financially difficult for affordable housing developments to provide parking. It can cost up to $50,000 per structured parking space, and as a result, it typically costs on the order of $200 or $300 to park in this off-street parking space. We know that the few low-income households that do own cars cannot afford to pay these monthly fees that would cover the cost of developing them, and as a result, typically park on street, which costs less. Surface parking naturally costs less to build. It's just paving over an existing lot. However, it takes up considerable space on the lot, and so there's a significant opportunity cost here when it comes to the ability to provide additional dwelling units that might be able to fit on site were it not for the surface parking. We know that requirements for parking make the funding of affordable housing more difficult. They reduce the amount of affordable housing that can be built with the same amount of public subsidy or available funding. Our current parking requirements today for affordable housing require about half as many parking spaces as do the parking requirements for market rate units. The parking requirements for affordable senior housing are even lower. It's about 60% less than what's required for market rate housing. And within the Manhattan core, downtown Brooklyn, and Long Island City today, we have no parking requirements for affordable housing. There are zoning waivers available if you build a small number of units or your lot is smaller than a certain size, depending on the zoning district. However, no such waivers are available to affordable senior housing. And as you'll see on the next slide, this is sort of particularly contradicts what we see in terms of car ownership rates among these households. Roughly 1 in 5 recent affordable housing developments qualified for waivers through zoning. However, not all of them chose to take advantage of this. Many of them also took advantage of mayoral overrides for the parking requirements. This is only available, however, for publicly owned sites, and as time goes on and these publicly owned sites get developed, we're left with a smaller number of sites that have the opportunity to obtain a mayoral override. So we've been looking closely at car ownership rates among low-income households and low-income senior households, and we found, in fact, that low-income households do own fewer cars, and this is especially true in dense transit-accessible neighborhoods. Low-income senior households have even lower rates of car ownership, regardless of where in the city they live. You can see the table on the bottom right shows car ownership rates among all housing units or residents of all housing units, low-income housing units, the HUD 202 senior housing, or the affordable independent living for senior housing type, and then the state-licensed senior long-term care facilities, and these are really nursing homes. Near transit, we see much lower rates of car ownership across the board, regardless of what housing type you're looking at, than we see far from transit. And also, as one would expect, you see lower rates of car ownership as you move sort of across the income spectrum. As I mentioned before, the high cost of parking, or the high cost of providing parking, results in high monthly cost to park in the spaces, making it less likely that low-income households are willing or able to rent their spaces. So what we're proposing to do is define a geography that we're referring to as the transit zone, which encompasses today many of the city's densest residential neighborhoods. These are multifamily zoning districts, proximate to a variety of public transportation options. They're typically within a 1/2 mile of a subway station, but they're always within walking distance to several bus lines. And most significantly, within this geography, car ownership rates among all households, and specifically affordable and affordable senior households, are low. So within this geography, we're proposing to do 3 primary things. The first would be to eliminate parking requirements for new, affordable, or inclusionary housing units within the transit zone. We would also be proposing to eliminate the parking requirements for new, affordable senior housing units, and also allow existing senior housing developments that have surface parking to reduce or eliminate existing parking in order to redevelop for presumably more affordable senior housing. We would also be proposing to create a discretionary action that would allow on a case-by-case basis market rate units as part of a mixed income development to reduce or eliminate their parking requirement in order to facilitate the development of this mixed income project. Currently, there are no discretionary actions available to reduce the amount of parking for these types of developments. And so, we've recognized that cost is obviously a significant factor in getting affordable housing built, and so we want to have this option available within the transit zone for market rate units as well. Outside of the transit zone, our modifications are much less dramatic. For affordable housing, what we're proposing to do is simplify the existing reduced parking requirements that I mentioned on an earlier slide, and apply. Today we have multiple categories that you can choose from if you're a developer that sort of regulate how you are required to provide parking. It's a complicated table. It refers to programs that are outdated and obsolete, and we're proposing to simplify that down to one category, which would apply to affordable housing outside of the transit zone. For senior housing, we're proposing to reduce the parking requirement for new low-income senior housing in medium-density districts to 10%, and eliminate the requirement entirely for new affordable senior housing in higher density districts, so R6 and above. As I mentioned before, we see very little variation in the very, very low rates of car ownership among senior housing residents. There is some variation closer to transit. We see the lowest. But even among affordable senior housing households further from transit, we simply see very, very low rates of car ownership. And so we're proposing to modify the zoning really to match the car ownership rates that we found. We would also allow existing affordable senior housing developments outside of the transit zone to reduce their surface parking or the parking that it may exist today. However, we would only allow this by discretionary action. So I'll turn it over to Frank now, who will give a little bit more information about the public review process.
Hi, Commissioners. I'm going to give a little background on the public review process to date and what we're doing currently in relation to the proposal. First, in February, we released information on the initial items that we were looking at, as well as the initial proposal and kind of ideas itself, as part of the document that would begin the environmental review for the proposal. To facilitate the beginnings of the public review conversations about the proposal, we began to hold information sessions at the borough board level and with community board leadership, as well as information sessions with other elected officials and stakeholders. Through that process, we heard a great deal of comments, first on the proposal itself, second on a desire to understand, particularly in their geographies, the effects of the proposal on those geographies. And third, a sense that they wanted to make sure that they would have appropriate time to actually review the proposal in the public review process. I'll talk about our responses to each of those individually, but just starting with the formal public review process, the DCP committed to allowing the full customary 2-month public review process review for community boards and borough presidents. After the summer recesses of community boards, one of the concerns people had was that they would not, given the summer review, they wouldn't have the ability to actually review it. We also, as part of this, are going to make sure that the zoning text amendment itself, the actual text, would be available before the start of the public review process. We've heard that from a lot of community boards. We want to make sure that they can actually look at it before and really understand it. So talking about some of the things that we heard as part of that process, we heard comments on the elements of the proposal. One of the things we heard a great deal about were some of the specific height changes associated with the contextual districts. And so as part of the, we made a series of refinements to the proposal that we described to communities beginning in May to really in many respects actually focus the proposal on its core goals of really facilitating affordable housing and good buildings. These changes affect 3 commonly mapped zoning districts, R6B, R7A, and R8B. And with the changes that or refinements that we created, I think in total 95% of all of the medium and high density contextual districts in the city see a height increase of 5 feet or less for a regular building, and for those providing affordable housing through the Inclusionary Housing Program or through affordable senior housing, they would have that same 95% would see increases of at most 2 stories, but most of them actually seeing increases of only 1. We also attempted to, one of the things I've been it's been interesting kind of talking to communities about this proposal, is that the variety of the city and the kind of built form of the city is actually quite varied, and the zoning resolution that tries to regulate it is itself quite varied. And one of the things that we tried to do, or we were asked to do, is really look to see how we could bring what is a proposal that is citywide, but actually down to the geographies of individual community boards. And so we've never really done anything like this before, but what we tried to do is create individual community profiles, where we took all of the different elements of the proposal and actually identified what changes would be applicable in each board, and what those changes would be. These are now all online, and this kind of as a way to try to provide information that brings the proposal to the district level, as well as actually drawing all of the various contextual districts that we have in the city, so people can actually see particularly on the height issues, what the actual changes would be in those districts themselves, because the variance from an R6A to an R10A is actually quite high. And also is something that I think, to the point of communities wanting to have a better, and make sure they understand the proposal before we begin the actual public review process. In some respects unprecedented for us, we actually offered to go to every community board before the start of public review. We offered all 59. I believe there were only a very limited number that actually didn't accept that offer, but to date we've had approximately 40 meetings with community boards, and this is on top of the kind of ongoing outreach that we have to other stakeholders, including elected officials, to other kind of housing advocates and other groups, to make sure that they understand the proposal and the issues that we're trying to address within it. So that, in total, is the proposal, and I think we wanted to just open it up to your questions. So,
Thank you, Frank,
and team.
Laura, Stacy. Everybody. Questions? Ms. Delos.
First, I just want to say I appreciate the presentation, and how, honestly, how detailed it has become as you've sought to explain this to folks in the neighborhoods. I think zoning can be complex, parking rules can be complex, and helping people understand what it means at the neighborhood level is critical, because obviously in many of the communities you're going out to, folks fought long and hard for contextual zoning, and they don't want neighborhood character to change as a result, even if they support more affordable housing. So I just want to say I definitely think that this helps communicate that much better than some of the original conversations. The question I have really has to do with the parking piece. I absolutely am in support of reducing parking requirements, both for senior and affordable housing. The question I have has to do with whether or not there was thought given to not just proximity to transit as part of reducing parking requirements, but also looking at average travel times in transit to employment. I kind of get it on the senior, but on the affordable side, as we go up the AMI levels, I'm just looking at particular Sunset Park. I think the average travel time to work in Sunset Park is 45 minutes. Maybe even an hour, and so it would be helpful to just kind of talk through that a little bit. And I'm just wondering if you look specifically at car ownership rates at differing AMI bands.
Sure. So to answer the first question about travel time, one of the things that we did do, and you can sort of tell, I'll walk up to the map in a moment, is even areas that are proximate to transit and do have multifamily zoning and are dense. In some areas where we had both DMV data and census data that shows a lot of people who may commute to work by car, or may live near transit, but we still see relatively high rates of car ownership, we carved them out. So Sunset Park is in, but Bay Ridge is not. Howard Beach and the Rockaways, and sort of out of respect for the time that it takes to get from the Rockaways into Manhattan or some of the other central business districts. Portions of the Bronx, too, we made these modifications. The sort of driving factor, no pun intended, to the transit zone was not trying to change people's behaviors, but changing zoning to reflect existing behaviors. So where we saw existing rates of auto commutes to work, we, made modifications to the transit zone. Where we saw very long travel times, but very low rates of car ownership, rather than providing parking for cars that weren't there despite the difficulties of getting places, we felt let's, free up more funding for housing. Your second question pertaining to income and auto ownership. It's very difficult for us to analyze car ownership by income. We have DMV data that allows us address level car ownership registration information. But to really know who the car is registered to, we have to know that the entire building is affordable or the entire building is market rate in order to have sort of a clean understanding of car ownership within a building. So we looked at the buildings that have been built that are 100% affordable. When we look at some of the housing types that may be under a public subsidy or were at one point Mitchell-Lama type developments, we don't see the same low rates of car ownership. And so we didn't want to sort of include that into the proposal. Looking at census data, we do see variation in car ownership by income at a broader geography level, but we can't analyze that data at such a local level that would enable us to draw the map a certain way. We also know that sort of moderate income households tend to own more cars because they have more money to spend since they're not spending it on rent. I mean, we don't know that as a definite fact, but we see that trend. So I think we're comfortable as it is with the low income, but understanding your point that there are variations.
Thank you.
Ms. Cantor.
I think the presentation was frank.
Huh?
I think the presentation was good, but I took something away from the presentation that goes something like this. We're going to increase the density by adding 1 or 2 floors in certain instances, which inherently increases the population, obviously, and at the same time, we're taking away all parking. I'm particularly concerned on the perimeters, and in this instance, I'll talk about the perimeters of Queens, where there's a boatload of cars coming in every morning from out in the island using the public streets to park. And for every potential space you take away, you're creating more congestion, in my view. The goal is great, but I question what's going to happen when whatever cars would have been accommodated in the future in these 2 types of constructions are now eliminated, so they're forced to go out on the street and compete with the out-of-cityers. I don't know whether parking permits have been considered within the local area. I know it has been used elsewhere with some degree of success. But unless we can limit the number of people coming into town, I don't see one occurring without the other because as I say, there's the cars coming in, there's the cars you're eliminating, which are going to be forced onto the street, and there's additional housing units being proposed, some of which will force cars onto the street.
So let me start. I'll start actually first with your point about the 1 to 2 additional stories, and then kind of go from
I'm
there.
not objecting to that.
Well, I want to just,
Consequences.
I think it's important to just clarify what's
Okay.
really going on there, which is the same floor area ratio. Right? Zoning really for a contextual district is really defined by 2 things. One, the floor area ratio you get or you have, and it's different in every zoning district, as well as the envelope. Right? And those 2 things work together to form building. The floor area ratio as part of this proposal really isn't changing. Right? The thing that's changing is the envelope to fit it. So the way I put it is I have a medium size shirt, I need a large size shirt to fit myself into it, and so that's all that it is, but it's not that in this instance, say, the floor area is changing.
You didn't get any-
So,
We're not getting another shirt.
well, we're getting an envelope that actually fits what you already have today.
Are we going to end up with 1 shirt or more than 1 shirt?
1 shirt.
One shirt.
1 shirt, 1
I'm gonna find a new I'll find a new metaphor. Right, that's, I think,
As long as you don't lose your shirt, Frank.
Well done.
but I think that's important because I think many people have kind of raised that concern that somehow by allowing additional stories, you're allowing more buildings to occur. And I think that's important it's one of the things that we always try to make sure people understand, which is you have the floor area today. And in most of the zoning districts that we're talking about, you can fit the floor area. You just have to make a series of really tough choices to fit it. You either squish all the floors, you put the building right up to the property line, you don't articulate the building at all, you don't provide ground floor retail where you may want to, or you put residential units right on the street, because you simply don't really have a way of actually designing a building without doing those things. So I think when we're talking about the height, that's really kind of making sure that you can fit the building and do those good things that people want to see in a building under the height limits that allow us to keep these contextual districts in place and actually just kind of slightly update them. So it's not really about an increase in density, or kind of increase there through that. And I think on the parking, and I think as Laura tried to describe, one of the issues that's trying to address is that we're requiring parking, which causes costs, that's costs to the city particularly for affordable housing, that makes it harder to make affordable housing development pencil out. All right, so here it's an issue of trade-off. On one side, we could require parking, particularly thinking about things like structured parking in medium and high density areas. That's really necessary and that kind of requires great cost to the development. And in many instances, the parking itself isn't actually used because the people who are living in that development or affordable housing development don't actually own a car. And so there are areas where we're effectively subsidizing the creation of empty parking rather than the creation of affordable housing.
And just to add to that, if it's by definition affordable or senior parking, and if a resident actually does own a car, they're in all likelihood not going to pay the $200 or $300 a month to park it in an unnecessary parking space, and they're going to park it on the street in any event. So we're really creating a huge capital expense, or generating a huge capital expense with, and it's all to the taxpayer, with very little yield into any neighborhood or to the public.
Would something like parking permits be of any possible potential in this issue?
And it's something that I know the city has looked at various times. I don't think it's utilized. It's certainly not part of this proposal. I think that there are a lot of issues with resident parking permits around the city, but it isn't something we've looked at with respect to this proposal.
And I think it's also just one other thing on that. It's important to remember this doesn't change the parking requirements for market rate housing. This is really only for affordable housing and affordable senior housing, which already today in zoning have lower parking requirements.
But you really haven't addressed the incoming flow from the outskirts. They're going to have the same rights and privileges
That's different.
as the affordable housing people will to park on the street.
Right, but if the residents of the new affordable housing aren't necessarily parking in those facilities, the affordable housing, we don't think that the affordable housing should be required to build parking for that other user group, right? That's not the proper responsibility of the...
I'm not suggesting that. What I'm asking, what I'm not suggesting, but what I'm asking is I got the feeling that eliminating all of those cars is going to put more cars on the street, and it's going to create more competition between the people who live in the perimeter areas and those incoming, even though you're limiting it only to the high transit areas. And that, again, takes me back, if it's the high transit areas, would permits be of value? Because if these guys are coming in from out of town and parking near high transit, there's going to be a fight for that space.
Ms. Treaty.
Just for clarification, if I understand correctly, if things work out the way they've been intended to, we wouldn't be necessarily putting more cars on the street because we believe those cars don't currently exist, that the units the affordable housing units that are being built that have the parking requirements, cars aren't there, so there's a lot of vacant garage space that's being created. Is that correct? So
Yes.
it doesn't increase the on-street parking demand.
I think that in total, we think that's true.
Ms. Ortiz?
So, for clarification on slide 25 with respect to this issue around cars, so at the 100% low-income units, what you're saying is about 39 of 100, so about 40% of households that are far from transit own cars. About 18%, is that the correct reading? 18%
Yes.
of households then? Okay, so, we would be affecting a band of 18%.
Yeah.
Presumably. And that's maybe really the
Yeah.
crux of this
So just
issue.
to clarify, we aren't really saying that low-income households don't own cars, and I think that is shown on here, that 18% of them do. But what we do firmly understand is that they can't afford to pay to park off-street. So one of two things happens. They don't park off-street, and they spend a lot of time, and it's admittedly a very difficult process, but they spend a lot of time to park on-street because it's free. Or in some way, the parking is subsidized, and that's at the expense of additional housing units. And we see that as a significant trade-off and not necessarily one that we think should be required. We're not going to be prohibiting the development of parking. And so certainly if there's a way to provide parking at a low cost and there's the demand to support it, we would allow that entirely. But as a matter of public policy, we don't necessarily think we should be requiring it, especially since in the vast majority of cases, those low-income households that own cars are unable to park off-street in the spaces for which they were required. I will also clarify somewhat, this table takes a very generic look at near transit. It was just, any household within a half mile of the subway. Many of the higher car ownership rates are found in some of the areas where we later carved out of the transit zone, like in portions of South Brooklyn and South Queens, North Bronx, really the areas that are on the fringe.
Ms. Levin?
Yes, thank you. I have a series of questions about height, which, as far as I can tell, is an area that you've had particular challenges with. At least reading public press and hearing from communities, it sounds like, there are a lot of myths floating around out there, and this presentation has done a lot to adjust the realities. But I think there's some legitimate concerns about how this plays out and how it relates to the mechanisms that we have to encourage the production of affordable housing. So I guess I have a bundle of questions. One is, and it seems to me that people are really mostly concerned about, when you're talking about the building envelope, people are really mostly concerned about height. Nobody really cares about yards, or some people care about setbacks because it makes for a lousy sidewalk experience, but of all of the issues that all of the elements of the envelope that you're trying to provide flexibility for here, it's height that's the one that really draws the most public attention, because many of these communities are ones that have very recently gone through rezonings, and in the sort of plain vanilla case, accepted a zoning designation with perhaps some more floor area than they might have been comfortable with, in exchange for the understanding that they would be contextual zones, therefore have height caps. So that was a bargain that they were willing to strike, and now the city's trying to undo that bargain by relaxing the cap, allowing the full density to be used rather than having it tempered by the height cap, which was the relief valve that the community wanted. I mean, that's the way it sort of reads to me here. So one question is, how much of what you're trying to accomplish could be accomplished by adjusting the periphery of the building, the other changes that you're making, rather than height? What effect does this have on special districts? I think some of which relate to contextual rules and some of which have their own height caps. Are you monkeying with the special districts? And how does this relate to the inclusionary housing plan? I know the housing plan does indicate as a priority making some changes in the voluntary program. I think there's some elements of the voluntary program that we all know don't work very well. It's going to have to be coupled with these text changes in order to get the kind of affordable housing we want to make. And are you, is HPD looking at a set of, or you or HPD, I guess it's text, so it has to be both of you together, looking at improvements in the voluntary program that could then be coupled with these height limits to make the whole thing more palatable.
So I'll start with talking about height. I guess I would say it this way. I think, to your point, I think most of the way, most communities, when they think about the zoning they have, don't think about port regulations, right? They think about height, particularly in the contextual districts. And so, I think we are very sensitive, and we want to make sure that the changes we're making are actually very sensitive to those conversations that occurred when those rezonings occurred. Right? So I think we're, trying to make the changes as limited as they needed or had to be to actually reflect contemporary best practices. And so that's kind of point number one. Point number two, I think, quite honestly, if we could do anything to not have to make changes to the height, if there were anything left that we could do, we would love to do it. But I think, quite honestly, one of the things that we've seen, even with the other limited changes we're making, we had to make adjustments to the height to actually better reflect. And I think it's important to remember it's really reflecting two things, particularly ground floors. It was an issue where there were many instances where you just had the difficulty of building a ground floor of retail use that actually worked, or you had the one thing that everyone in any community, when we've talked about this, they get this point, which is our contextual rules sort of in total are forcing, if you have a building that is a residential use on the ground floor, the unit itself to actually be right at the grade of the sidewalk. And that makes for this condition where you walk by and all of a sudden the shades are drawn. It's kind of really not the condition of other neighborhood buildings. So those height changes we needed to get those to actually make the entirety of the building work. One of the things as a balancing mechanism to that we've included in the proposal is something that actually quite surprisingly contextual districts don't talk about, which are actually maximum number of stories. So that you can't, for example, you get an additional amount of height as part of this proposal and then just use it to squish in another floor of additional floor area. So you're limited both by the number of stories and the maximum height as part of the proposal. And that's true of all the zoning, that would be true of all the zoning districts. So I think we found with whatever other adjustments we were making, that height really was something that we had to address. And so we've tried to be as, just in summary, really sensitive to it as possible. That's why when we look at the contextual districts, we're really talking about something like 95% of them 5 feet. When you then look at the inclusionary program, particularly where you do get additional density, but you really don't have anywhere to put it, there were clear examples, I think, in CHPC pointed this out, where you can't really develop the density, and particularly this is for buildings that are providing affordable housing. We wanted to make sure our zoning envelopes work for those. And I think it's one of the things that I would say is when those conversations were occurring in communities, they were occurring under the idea that that program would work and those buildings would provide affordable housing. And if the envelope is the thing that's actually causing that not to occur, we'd like to correct that, provide a way for it to. Special districts, there's something like 46 of them, each are special in their own special way. In general, our baseline rule is if there is something in a special district that really mirrors the underlying changes that we're making to the contextual districts, we would update that. If there is a special height or a special building envelope that exists in that special district that's kind of different than any of the underlying regulations, we wouldn't update that. So the kind of iconic example we always give is Clinton Preservation has a height limit of 66 feet. I assure you no other number in the zoning resolution 66 feet. We're not adjusting that as part of this change. However, there are places like West Chelsea that has on one street, it says the underlying regulations apply and then shows the height limit in a chart. And the chart, if we're changing the underlying height regulations, we need to update the chart to reflect that those two things are the same. And so there's a kind of scale of changes within that. I would say in summary, most of the special districts aren't changing. And one of the things that we did as part of those profiles is not only show the maps and show the kind of changes as part of this, the kind of underlying changes, but actually for each of the special districts, have a page devoted to each special district and go into relatively extreme detail about what changes would be applicable in that district and what specific pieces of the district itself would change. So try to address those issues that we raised up. But I think our kind of main thought is just really reflect the underlying changes, not reopen neighborhood conversations about them.
Good. And are those being well received in your community presentations?
Yeah, I think because there really is more, those changes for the special districts are really more limited in scale compared to some of the changes to just the general underlying districts. I think people have been more, they've been understanding of those.
Well, and it helps tone down the hyperbole that's surrounded a lot of this in the public conversation, I think.
Do you want to?
I'll just, on the subject of inclusionary housing and in particular, the aspect of the proposal that involves additional height for affordable senior housing and inclusionary housing is actually, I'm going to try and describe it without talking about my clothing. Or Frank's clothing for that. But essentially, the contextual zoning envelope, the idea of the contextual zoning envelope is there's a certain amount of floor area, give it enough room to fit in a form that will be predictable, responsive to the surrounding environment, but there's not a whole lot of additional flexibility. We have two categories of housing that get more floor area, right? It's inclusionary housing and affordable senior housing. And just fundamentally, adding that into that envelope forces one of two things. Either, well, it makes you put your additional floor area where you didn't want to put it before, right? If it's an incentive, you're going to take the portion of the envelope you were otherwise electing not to use, maybe make the building deeper, flatten it, push it closer to the street. The decisions that you were trying not to make in the contextual design decision are decisions that you then have to make in order to take the incentive. And that's creating this opposition that we really don't want to have. The incentive is supposed to be something that makes it possible to fit that building in a desirable way. And so for both of those categories of housing, we identified the additional space it would take to give you essentially that same amount of flexibility that you would have in an ordinary contextual envelope. And that's the concept.
Right. No, I understand the concept.
No, and you had a second question, which is about other changes to the...
Correct, because there's been some advocacy surrounding, so while you're at it, to support these programs, why don't you make these other changes too?
Right.
So.
I think the next, we do have a lot of things to do on the subject of inclusionary housing, but the next major thing that we are hoping to do is the introduction of the mandatory inclusionary housing program, which would be applied in future zoning changes. And then beyond that, we have expressed a desire to look at the existing program and find other types of improvements we can make to it. But in the immediate future, I mean, this is in fact something that helps. If you look at where all the inclusionary housing has been built under the current program, it's in the places where the contextual envelope doesn't apply. It's in Manhattan, it's on the west side, it's in Greenpoint Williamsburg on the waterfront, where we did give additional height when you opted into the inclusionary housing program. So it is an element that will help that program do what it was intended to do. There are obviously there are many ideas out there about inclusionary housing, but we do think that that's going to make a positive contribution.
I don't know, it just seems like some movement on some of those other issues when coupled with this height is going to help you get the height in this go-round.
Understood.
Ms. Ortiz and Ms. Efron.
Hi. So you mentioned that for most communities, you said in most cases, 95% of cases, you're only looking at a 5-foot increase in height limits. So, just to understand the rationale here, as I look at, the desire to increase the floor-to-floor ratio, particularly on the ground floor, which is important to, for retailers and for upper storage. So it still seems tight, right? It still seems that you're only adding, you mentioned under an existing scenario, existing scenarios, most floors are 9.6. We're looking at adding 4 inches per floor to get up to 10 feet. And on the ground floor, adding 2 feet, so we get from 13 feet to 15. We're still, the increment is really quite small. Is that a result of sort of the feedback you received in the community concern to like keep the height really low?
I think it was our honest assessment of every zoning district and trying to take those best practice assumptions and test all of the envelopes. I think it's something that these envelopes were created over time, most of them in the 80s under a certain series of assumptions, and then some over time after that. We've never really looked at all of them together and said, do they work and how do they work with today's building practices? So we tried to do that for all of them. And I think our overall impression was that for a building that is utilizing just the existing floor area, doesn't have the additional floor area of inclusionary or affordable senior housing, you could fit the floor area, you just kind of had to make a series of choices that were maybe tough. So the changes that were needed there from a height perspective were really limited. They really just needed the ability to give the, I guess the way to put it is give the floors a little bit of breathing room. So that was our assessment, and that's how when we began the proposal, those were really the kind of core things that we were doing. And I think it's kind of it's both a reflection of what we saw as what was needed, but I think it's also quite honestly these contextual districts that we recognize that people think about these districts from the height that they have, right? And so the changes that we're trying to make are not to blow them open or kind of make them completely different than what they are, but really just tweak them a little bit to actually make them work well. So I think that's why I think for us, what some people say maybe limited increases, others have said are very,
Absolutely
impactful
no.
increases. I think we think of them as what was the thing that was needed.
So just then for clarification, if it's mostly 5 feet, does that mean that for most districts, we're talking about 5 feet, does that mean that for most districts, we're really looking at, 6 to 8-story buildings, right? Because if the increment is that small on each, in order to increase each floor, we're really talking about areas that have what I might call relatively low density areas.
Generally, the contextual districts are mapped, the bulk, the great number of the contextual districts are really the R6, R7, and R8, maybe. If you look at those, they really reflect almost 95% of the medium
So what's
density.
the average number of floors in those districts, more or less, from?
R7 is about 8, I guess you'd say, depending on how you're looking at it. The highest density, so when you get to R9A, R10A, which are really predominantly mapped in Manhattan, wide avenues, say, example, on the Upper East Side, they're, and just given the scale of the building there, we're talking about height limits that are much higher, but the scale of the increase was really like, say, an additional story on top of that, so 15 feet. And that really is, in some respects, kind of when you look at it as a percentage basis, is actually even smaller than those 5 feet.
Yeah.
The others.
Okay, thank you.
Ms. Efron.
Thanks. I wanted to commend the department on your transparency. I think. Sorry. Really, it was just a compliment. It's not going on. On the transparency, particularly around the website and choosing to identify certain options and letting the average citizen who perhaps is not involved in his or her neighborhood group understand the contextualization and the rezoning. And similarly, going out to all the community boards seems like a very, very high concentration of time for a lot of effort. So thank you. I did have a question about the parking. So if the department has concluded that the parking is not the best use of capital, and that future development could happen on those sites, which makes sense to me personally. Granted that that's not going to happen immediately, does it make sense, or have you and HPD discussed the possibility of allowing that parking to be public parking in the interim to cross-subsidize the residential, the low-cost residents?
Build more units, personally.
Sure. I mean, in a lot of neighborhoods that happens already, not with HPD or publicly subsidized housing, but in private market rate buildings, it's not quite a loophole, but if you want to have attended parking, you have to get a DCA license, and DCA requires that you post the prices on, that are visible from the street, which then effectively makes you a public parking garage. HPD has obviously a much more regulated sort of program for how they can do things on site. I do think there would be a palette for that. It's not something that we've talked about specifically as part of this proposal, but it's something that is sort of more broadly seen as, the whole idea of parking as a shared neighborhood resource as opposed to something where a space is allocated to a unit in that building. Is certainly something that we're thinking of.
I bring it up because this commission has been faced with some recent luxury housing or market rate housing projects where, at least in one case, the parking to apartment ratio was 1-to-1. So granted, that was in a different neighborhood than most of the ones you're talking about, but there seems that, at least along the edges, there may be an opportunity to help cross-subsidize some of the units in the interim.
Just to add to what Laura said, I think it's an interesting question. The dynamic, as Laura's saying, between what happened, how parking spaces are actually used in neighborhoods is more complex than is commonly appreciated. That said, we would also, this is an issue we haven't thought of and incorporated into this proposal, as you've seen. We would also want to think about the extent to which we want parking lots to be the long-term use of a piece of property, right? There's obviously a balance. Parking, structured parking in a garage may present a different decision because, we're probably not trying to. One of the things we don't want to do is perpetuate the use of these lots as parking with conjunction with these facilities. But it's an interesting question as to how they can be used. They can be rented on a monthly basis to non-residents in general. And if you ask anyone who sort of knows, they're like the nephew of one of the senior residents uses one space, or, the employees just use, because they're there, people use them. But whether we want to put in place provisions that would allow revenue generation from them is an interesting additional question.
Mr. Cantor.
Right. If I understood you correctly earlier on the issue of density and height, or FAR, you said that fundamentally the FAR controls, and it will not create additional housing in a general sense. Am I correct?
I think that's what I said. That's right.
Okay. Now, if I can remember where I started. And I go, whoops, that's it. I'll come back to me as soon as I understand what I want to say.
It may be my shirt metaphor, which is getting.
That may be the last word. No? Mr. Knuckles.
Frank, I see this is focused on the residential areas R6 through R8. What about a district like a C44, where both housing and commercial are permitted? What do you foresee there?
So the way that zoning works is that if you're building a residential building in one of those commercial districts, you have a residential district equivalent. So changes would have applicability in commercial districts as well as the residential.
Okay. And I just wanted a clarification on page 31, where it says refinements from initial scope.
Yeah.
And it says original versus current.
So
What's original?
The original was what the scope had as part of the scoping document, and when we initially began describing the proposal,
Right.
This is an example in the R7A district. This was the maximum height that we were proposing for a market rate building. And
95.
That's correct. And the proposal modified that, or the current version of that, and kind of refined, is that the maximum height of an R7A building would be 85 feet. So this was an example of one of the refinements to one of the three zoning districts that we made changes to.
The refinement is the 95 feet.
The refinement is the original version that was in the draft scope of work had a maximum height of 95 feet. The current version of this that we would propose is that height would be 85 feet. I get your question today.
What's the current zoning?
80. I get it. Maximum height is 80. So the increase originally, as in the scope, was shown as an increase of 15 feet from 80 to 95.
Okay.
We modified that to go from 80 to 80.
Yeah, I thought current zoning.
Sorry.
Okay,
That's-
thank you.
Mr. Cantor, yes, you can
Yeah, I know where I was trying to...
have another attempt here.
Another attempt. When we were talking about the floor-to-floor heights, and the 5 feet, basically the 5 feet is to accommodate the floor-to-floor.
Right.
Many years ago, when we started this business, the code required, I think, 8 foot 0.5 ceilings, not floor-to-floor. And over the past years, the developers started moving to higher numbers, particularly for luxury housing, so that now the 9 foot has become a common number, or even a little slightly higher. But it's really very cheap money, because the foundations of the building are going to be virtually the same. The roof of the building is virtually the same. The inches worth of incremental height are only going to affect piping and maybe an extra riser, et cetera. But it's a disproportionate give, which is good. So you're loosening up the street floor, you're creating a better apartment layout, not layout, but apartment feeling by going for the higher floor to floor. I think it's a good give. And I think we should try to convince the community of that.
I think for us, it's a number of things that it's able to address. I think the ground floor is one thing.
Right.
Different construction techniques. Modular is one example that we've heard that just the trying to make a modular construction building work, let's call it floor-to-floor heights of a modular building really don't work under these contextual building envelopes because they're just more than what was assumed as part of the 87 regulations. Beyond that, I think it's important, and something that Chris said, is it's not only market practice has changed, but it's also other regulations that kind of guide the development of housing. So building code changes, other safety regulations have changed, and all of those things in total have kind of raised the floor-to-floor height of a building or of a residential unit. And that's true not only of luxury residential, that's true also of affordable housing, right? So the best practices for HPD affordable housing is really looking at 10-foot floor-to-floor height too, right? So that we're trying to accommodate really kind of the typical building best practices, not, super luxury best practice. I imagine to the point of if we gave more height, people who are trying to build 14-foot, 15-foot floor-to-floor heights, they would love it. But this is really, again, speaking to a good best practice residential building.
I just add something Commissioner Cantor mentioned, these sort of if you start with an 8-foot floor to ceiling,
Right.
and you want to add a setback in the building on the right.
Oh, I'm
You
not...
have no, I'm just saying that you've illustrated something which I think is important. If you want to put in a transfer beam, you're losing a story of your building just by putting in the setback. So all these things come together. This is one of the reasons why you get the flat box, is because it requires less. The other rules are going to punish you for doing something that's not the flat box. So all of these different provisions, having just a few inches more of flexibility, does enable a lot more variety in the way that you can construct.
Well, what you're really saying, though, you're stealing from the floor to floor on a typical floor. Because if you're going to be using a portion of that to put in transfer girders, transfer beams, then that is going to control the height, and thereby you would be forced to go down on floor to floor. So it's a trade-off.
And what we're doing is we're not punishing people as much as the current rules would punish them for making that decision, right? Today, the rules really make it difficult for you to do that because you're gonna run into the overall height limit.
So Ortiz.
Hi. It strikes me that, and it was mentioned a little earlier, some of the responses is part of a marketing issue, how people are perceiving this as opposed to what it really is. And the concern around height has dominated the conversation. And I think as a pedestrian, most of us experience a neighborhood at the street level. Less so, we're not 50, 60, 70 feet up in the air experiencing the 5-foot difference. And, perhaps what might be useful is to take an example of a fairly hideous
That's the Fourth
building.
Avenue building.
Right, right. That, that is built under these existing conditions, and imagine a scenario where, less so the historic building. I think people, appreciate the historic building, but, what could have happened instead? I just recently, I was, walking through Bed-Stuy, and you could tell which buildings just, don't fit. And I don't think most neighbors are happy with those buildings in their neighborhood. But, if they could see that under this current zoning, the buildings that could have been there and occupied those spaces would be a much better fit at the ground floor, regardless of how high they are, perhaps it would be an easier pill to swallow.
I think that's something that the AIA and the kind of variety of chapters of the AIA in New York has kind of expressed a very similar point, which is their members experience these rules, and when they're trying to design a building, they've designed many buildings under them, and thinking, they themselves are thinking about trying to almost kind of look back and say, well, this is what we built, but if these changes existed, this is what we could have built, and actually be able to demonstrate that on, call it, real buildings in neighborhoods. So that's something that they've stated that they're doing, that they want to do. We are, of course, supportive of that and try to be as full in that process as possible. Because I think you're right, that I think in some respects, I think even when you talk to people and kind of say, we're talking in many instances 5 feet, they get that and they say, okay, that's not really all that much. But I think it's useful to begin to talk about it in relation to how it affects us. Because I think for us, one of the things that we've really seen is that condition in the building on the street is actually important, right? The idea of these contextual districts is to make a building that actually looked good and worked in the neighborhood, and in total, they're maybe not getting there today.
Exactly.
I think the other thing, just quite honestly, is something that we have seen in kind of doing all of these presentations is they have concerns about this proposal, but they have worries and kind of concerns about housing and how their neighborhoods are changing in general.
Exactly.
And so this is kind of a element that we're talking about with communities and other stakeholders. This is kind of, those issues are coming up as part of the conversation about this proposal too. It isn't entirely, it isn't rationally only about this proposal. It's about the larger issues that are affecting us.
Exactly.
Any other questions? Well, I want to thank the entire team, Chris, Laura, Stacy, Frank, Howard, and everyone who's been working on this here. It's a very complex issue. I do want to say to all of my fellow commissioners that obviously all of us deal with zoning resolution regularly and are very conversant in it, much more so than any other audience that presentations are made to. And so I want to ask you if you see ways that we can make this presentation more compelling and simpler. And if there are things here you don't fully understand, we'd obviously like to know about it, because if you don't understand it, then it's going to be very complicated for other audiences that don't deal with the zoning resolution every day. So on this, which still has not entered the public review process, still will be subject to some additional tweaks before it does, for sure. Your thoughts and advice on it would be very helpful. The second thing I'd like to say is something that Howard said at the beginning and Frank said at the end, which is this is one piece of a very ambitious housing program. And this in and of itself is not going to produce a huge number of housing units. It's really designed to make the quality of housing better, and also to avoid spending public money unnecessarily that can be then deployed to affordable and senior housing elsewhere, and to make the process, particularly for senior housing, a little more efficient. All of us have seen over the years and scratched our heads about why there should be a special permit to create certain kinds of senior housing facilities in certain neighborhoods, which has always seemed to us a special permit that had outlived its usefulness, if it ever did have any usefulness. So there are things like that that we can just make easier. And then finally, I do think, to the point that Ms. Ortiz raised, one of the goals here is to make contextual neighborhoods more attractive. And one of the irony in some respects is that the goal of contextual neighborhoods was to create a sense of stability and a certain housing type, a certain neighborhood that has existed historically in this city. And because of the constraints of quality housing and contextual districts, what we've seen are buildings that don't reflect the goals of the original contextual neighborhoods, except height. And that's one important goal, obviously, but it's not the only goal. And we want, I think the major goal, especially when the trade-offs are so very, very limited, is to be able to have the kinds of neighborhoods that New Yorkers are comfortable in, and that is neighborhoods that particularly reflect the variety of and activity that we want to see at street level. And so all of those are goals, and it's been complicated, to be sure, and will continue to be complicated as we discuss this with communities all over the city. But we appreciate your thoughts on it and ongoing constructive suggestions. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks to the team.
Thank you so much. He waves goodbye. He's such a sweet guy. He's such a sweet guy.
The sliver law still in place, right? The sliver law will still be in place.
Yeah,
because the
it
every
does.
number was
I mean, it's true that some,
once we have the highest percentage increase under this. So it's proportionally, it cannot be sliver law. Yeah, right, that's right. That's something that they should probably be clear in the presentation, because that undermines a hard fought win in the 70s on the Upper East and Upper West Side. And I noticed they signed on, all the community groups signed on to it.
Yeah, well, a lot of people are involved with it because of all the presentations.
Right. Okay.
Carl. The sliver law still applies, right?
Quite the warm-up.
Same to Ken.
Commissioners, let's now move to item number 2, page 1. It's a proposed disposition of 2 city-owned properties in Community District 4 in Brooklyn. I'd like to introduce Sarit Plotkin from the Brooklyn office, who's making her very first presentation before the commission today.
All right, good afternoon, everybody. This is an application by the New York City Department of Citywide Administrative Services to facilitate the disposition of 2 city-owned properties in Bushwick Community District 4, Brooklyn, pursuant to zoning. The sites include 93A Star Street, Site 1, you see over here, and 9 Moffett Street, Site 2. DCAS intends to dispose of the 2 vacant interior lots pursuant to Section 384 of the New York City Charter. While there are no development projects associated with either of the properties currently, the approvals will reserve the right for the city to dispose of the properties in the future. Site 1 is located in an R6 zoning district in northwest Bushwick on the west side of Star Street between Knickerbocker and Wilson Avenues. Building types and uses on the subject block and surrounding neighborhood are typified by 2 to 3 story multifamily walk-up buildings. There are also 1 to 3 story commercial and mixed-use buildings along Knickerbocker and Wilson Avenues, the adjacent commercial corridors. The site is 0.4 miles northwest of the closest subway station, the Central Avenue stop on the M line, which is actually just south. And it is served by the B60 bus that runs along Wilson Avenue. The site is half a block from Maria Hernandez Park, the largest green space in Bushwick. and it is 0.2 miles from PS 123 Sidam, which is just the northeast corner of the park. Site 2 is located in an R6 zoning district with a C13 commercial overlay in southeast Bushwick on the west side of Moffett Street between Broadway and Bushwick Avenue. Building types and uses on the subject block are typified by 1 to 3 story multifamily and community facility buildings, including the Moffett Gardens Assisted Living Facility, which is across the street from the site. On Broadway and Bushwick Avenue, the adjacent commercial corridors, there are 1 to 3 story commercial, mixed use, and community facility buildings, including the Bushwick Multi-Service Center, down the corner. The site is 300 feet from the nearest subway station, the Chauncey stop on the J&Z elevated line, here. And it is 0.4 miles from the Bushwick Avenue Aberdeen stop on the L train. It is also served by the B60, B20, and Q24 bus lines. Site 1 is an irregular vacant interior lot with no street frontage, approximately 1,135 square feet in area. It abuts 2 private properties with frontage on Star Street. It was originally part of the adjacent parcel, Block 3186, Lot 44, but in 1971 was reapportioned into the current Lot 144. The reapportionment created a 4 by 65-foot easement along the western side of Lot 44 to allow egress for the 875 square foot portion of the rear yard. So as you can see here, that is the gate to the easement, the side yard, another image of the side yard, and the rear yard. The city acquired Site 1 in 1986 through in-rem tax foreclosure and has been the owner since. DCAS has entered into a short-term lease with the owners of Lot 44 to allow them access to the site. Site 2 is a 16 by 100-foot vacant interior lot of approximately 1,667 square feet with frontage on Moffett Street. The city acquired it in 1979 through in-rem tax foreclosure. The property was fenced off and has remained vacant, as you can see in the photos here. The city acquired it, the 3 other city-owned lots adjacent to Site 2 were disposed of between 1987 and 1992. Site 2 currently abuts 4 vacant privately held parcels that together comprise 8,000 square feet. DCAS is seeking disposition approval for 2 city-owned properties in Brooklyn Community Board 4 pursuant to zoning and Section 384 of the New York City Charter. Given that it lacks street frontage, Site 1 is not considered developable and will potentially be disposed of through the DCAS Sale Away program, which authorizes DCAS to sell small and undevelopable city-owned parcels directly to adjacent owners. Site 2 has street frontage, is considered developable, and will potentially be disposed of through a New York City real estate public auction. There is no upcoming public auction date. In conclusion, while there are no development projects planned for either property currently, the approvals will afford the city the flexibility to dispose of them for future use.
Questions for Sarit? Ms. Delos.
I love to hear when we're cleaning things up that go back 40 years. I don't have any questions about Lot 1, but on Lot 2, especially given what you said about its proximity to other sites that are developable, I'm wondering if there's been consideration about, and the likelihood of it being part of a larger assemblage, of putting any discussions about affordability requirements as part of the sale.
So my understanding is that DCAS has not broached that topic yet, given the infrequency of public auctions. There were no public auctions between 2009 and 2013, so there's, potentially time, there is potentially quite a bit of time before the next public auction, and I think we haven't broached those topics yet, but there is time still to discuss those issues. And I can definitely check with DCAS about that.
Yeah, I can imagine that the local community would raise that same issue, which we'll find out.
Indeed. Ms. Marin.
Along those same line of questions, do we know who the owners of the other 3 empty lots are? I mean, that may help facilitate a better decision, because if they're in some kind of HPD program or whatever program, it may be of benefit to join it with those other for a better developable parcel.
Yeah, so these two parcels on the corner that are in black here, those are actually sites that were disposed of under previous dispositions that I mentioned. So we are definitely, aware, or we're aware when they were disposed of who they were, but I'm sure that we can kind of look into that and find out more about that.
Any other questions? Mr. Knuckles?
I do have, the two prior lots that have been disposed of, they're not built on as we speak,
Correct.
right?
They're vacant.
Now, at one time, the city used to put requirements on auction off properties for something to happen regarding building on those properties, as opposed to just having the properties sit. Hence, that's why they were auctioned off with the hope that they were going to be. So do we still have those requirements? Are people still required to build on the properties within a certain time frame?
So my understanding is that those requirements are not necessarily part of the public auction agreement, but I think they can be part of it. I don't think they're automatically part of it.
If I understand Mr. Knuckles' question, it's really whether the adjacent lots were subject to that provision, which I think we can investigate and let you know, because obviously if it is under a restriction to develop within a certain period of time, that would make this sale or the potential sale of this site much more appealing to that landowner. Any other questions for Sarit? If not, this is certified, and we'll have answers to your questions upon its return, if not sooner. Thanks.
Let's advance to item number 3, page 13. It's proposed City Planning Commission certification to permit a plaza bonus on property to be developed with predominantly residential use in sub-area A of the Special Sheepshead Bay District. I'd also like to introduce Daphne Lundy, who's also making her very first presentation before the commission. She's also from the Brooklyn office. We're on item number 3, page 13.
Bet you never expected to see Emmons Avenue before us so quickly again.
Anna.
I am Deutsch.
Good morning. Oh, I'm sorry. Good afternoon. It's been a while. Good afternoon, Chairman Weisbrod, Commission. This is a private application for commission certification for floor area bonus pursuant to the Special Sheepshead Bay District, Section 9413. By providing a plaza, this would generate a floor area bonus of 31,629 square feet and facilitate a mixed-use residential and commercial development. The project is Area A of the Special Sheepshead Bay District, shown here, within an R5 C22 zoning district. It is bounded by the Belt Parkway Service Road to the north, East 19th Street, Emmons Avenue to the south, and Sheepshead Bay Road to the west. Area A is one full block and zoning lot. The total area is 42,172 square feet. The Special Sheepshead Bay District is comprised of 20 blocks and 80 subdistricts, areas A through H, with regulations governing development and permitted uses for each area. The Special Sheepshead Bay District was established in 1973 to promote and strengthen the waterfront character of the area. It also sought to encourage the development of housing with amenities, to improve vehicular and pedestrian circulation, and to encourage the creation of public open space as part of new developments. At the time of the creation of the Special Sheepshead Bay District, there are over 10 vacant acres of land along Emmons Avenue. Area A was mapped as a site that was deemed suitable for higher density development because of its proximity to the subway and commercial uses along Sheepshead Bay Road, which the train station is slightly north from here. Residential and community facility uses are permitted as of right. Water-dependent uses such as boat clubs are also permitted, along with restaurants of unlimited size and frontage. Other uses are outlined in Use Group SB, Sheepshead Bay, and are limited to a maximum of 3,500 square feet with a frontage of 35 feet. The current basic residential floor area for Area A is 1.25. In Area A, all developments with frontages along Emmons Avenue are required to provide and maintain a plaza for public use that abuts the Emmons Avenue street line and is at least 4,000 square feet. At least 15% of the plaza area must be landscaped and planted with trees. The plaza must also contain lighting, pedestrian walks, and sitting areas. Permitted obstructions include kiosks, open cafes, and sculptures not to exceed 30% of the total plaza area. Developments in Area A are also eligible for a floor area bonus by providing additional plaza area or an arcade, not to exceed an FAR of 2. The additional floor area may be used for residential use on the same zoning lot or may be transferred to a receiving lot within the special district. The aggregate bonus floor area permitted should not be more than 60% of the basic FAR of 2. The surrounding area consists of commercial, residential, and transportation uses zoned R4, R5, and R6 with C1 and C22 overlays. The project site was formerly occupied by a commercial use, the El Greco Diner. To the north of the project area is a cluster of 1 to 2 story commercial uses along Sheepshead Bay, shown here, as well as several 6-story apartment buildings with a cluster of 1 to 2 family homes along East 19th Street, Voorhees Avenue, and Ocean Avenue. Along the western edge, there are 3 6-story apartment buildings, mixed-use buildings with retail on the ground floor, and that's outside of the special district. So this area here. The site is also adjacent to the Emmons Avenue Promenade that connects to several parks in the area, as well as the Sheepshead Bay footbridge that connects to Manhattan Beach and Shore Boulevard Promenade, shown in the picture in the bottom left. The proposed development will consist of a 7-story mixed-use building with ground floor and first floor commercial uses. Potential uses would be those allowed in the special Sheepshead Bay district, such as restaurants. The portion of the proposed development with frontages along Emmons Avenue and Sheepshead Bay Road will rise to 2 stories. The remaining portion of the building will be set back. A 35-foot deep setback will be provided along Emmons Avenue, shown here, and a 10-foot deep setback would be provided along all of the frontages. This reflects the special height and setback regulations of Area A of the special Sheepshead Bay district. At the time of the creation of the special district, plaza guidelines were limited. The proposed plaza will create a privately owned public plaza that matches current standards for POPs, and will include amenities beyond the requirements of the special Sheepshead Bay district. The plaza will extend along Sheepshead Bay Road and Emmons Avenue frontages, where the entrances would be located for commercial retail spaces. The plaza will be open and accessible at all times and contain 9,037 square feet. POP's public signage will be displayed at each corner of the plaza along Emmons Avenue, East 19th Street, and Sheepshead Bay Road. So along each of these corners. 13 trees will be planted in the plaza, 5 at grade and 8 in planters that would include planter-ledge seating. The total planting and landscaping of the plaza will be 20%, which is above the minimum of 15% in the special Sheepshead Bay district. Because this area is in the flood zone, planting species chosen for the plaza will be salt tolerant to mitigate the loss of trees and shrubs following a flooding event. As per POP's regulation, there will be 3 types of seating provided: 4 movable tables with chairs, 210.19 linear feet of fixed bench and planter ledge seating, as well as 29.07 linear feet of sculptural seating. There will also be a private cafe seating provided that will be associated with the ground floor commercial uses. And this is shown in blue. The plaza will also include 11 lampposts. There will also be 6 trash can receptacles within 50 feet of all seating areas. The permitted obstructions total 2,707 square feet and do not exceed the 30% of the total floor area as per special Sheepshead Bay District Plaza regulations. The plaza will also include an 8-foot wide circulation path throughout. 2 bicycle racks will be provided on the sidewalks along Emmons Avenue and Sheepshead Bay Road as per DOT standards. So the circulation path is the hatching, and there should be a bike rack here and then along Emmons Avenue. By providing a plaza as per 9408 special floor area provisions, the plaza will generate a floor area bonus of 0.75 FAR, 31,629 square feet. With the additional bonus, the proposed development will contain 81,220 square feet, 26 square feet of residential floor area, within 58 residential dwelling units located on floors 2 to 7, and 3,118 square feet of commercial floor area on the first floor, for a total FAR of 2. The ground floor contains a total of 21,055 square feet of commercial floor area. It is a cellar and does not count towards zoning floor area. The project will also include 134 parking spaces. I would also like to note that the area is in the 100-year flood zone. New buildings in the flood zone are required to comply with flood-resistant standards in the NYC Building Code. And as such, the residential lobby portion of this building will be wet flood-proofed, and the ground floor commercial will actually have deployable flood shield that will be installed prior to a storm. And this rendering actually shows some of the floodgates and stuff. And that's everything.
Thank you, Daphne. Questions?
Yeah, question, please.
Go ahead, Mr. Cantor.
Do they have any plans for the roof of the commercial?
So because this isn't a flood zone, normally people would provide parking beneath, but what they're doing is providing parking partially on the first floor and then some parking on the second story roof.
Parking on the second perimeter. How are they going to buffer the parking from the windows of the housing?
It doesn't seem like there is. I can check in with them, but I don't believe that there is some sort of obstruction to block that.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
For the parking on the first floor, I know that they are glazing the windows, so you wouldn't be able to see it from the street.
Ms. Levin and Ms. Efron.
Yet again, we're reminded how unusual the Sheepshead Bay Special District is. Actually, there's 3 things I want to check. This is a certification, but we're still referring it out to the community board, right? So we're going to get another swing at this after we hear what the community board has to say?
Yes.
Is that right? Okay. Which is reassuring. If I understand this correctly, the open space is mandatory. They have to provide that open space, but then they get a bonus for it too?
So they have to provide a minimum open space of 4,000 square feet, and if they provide additional open space, they can generate a floor area bonus. So instead of providing the 4,000, they've gone up to around 9,000.
But it looks like maybe I did the math wrong, it looks like they're getting the bonus for all of the floor area, not just the increment.
That's correct.
Okay, and so they're doing what they have to do, and they're getting a bonus for it.
Well, I think, as you probably are familiar with the other projects in the special district, the text is sort of complicated to interpret in that sense.
Yeah.
But the way we met with zoning, and we've had this conversation beforehand, and it seems the way that it was interpreted and the fact that they are kind of using the base and adding onto it was a correct interpretation of the text.
Okay. And then the second thing.
So they're doing a mandatory plus mandatory, and then they get the full.
But they get the bonus on the mandatory plus.
On the mandatory plus, not just the plus.
Yeah, so that's unique. But, why does that? It's perfectly consistent with the special
There are
Sheepshead
so
Bay
many
district.
special things about this area. So.
But the other thing that's interesting to see, and this one is not unique in special Sheepshead Bay, is you got 21,000 square feet of commercial space that's on the ground floor, but it's called a cellar, so it's not floor area. I think we all approved those rules.
We did.
But I've not.
Well, I didn't, but you did.
They look a little bit different when you're looking at a commercial strip like that and being told that it's not floor area. Yeah.
So.
They were good, actually, go ahead, Deb.
I'm not saying it to challenge it, but to just say, whoa, it looks a little bit different from, once you go through the process and you say, oh, that all makes intuitive sense, and then a picture like this comes back and you go, oh.
So this is really an issue we see in areas where the flood elevation above grade is about 6 feet or 5 feet, because at that point you might be half of the floor. So depending on how high the developer chooses to do the floor to ceiling heights on the ground floor, a difference between 10 feet floor to ceiling versus 13 feet floor to ceiling might be the difference between a basement and a cellar. And in this case, I believe the floor to ceiling height on the ground floor where there would be retail is 10 feet, and because of that, it kind of falls into the cellar category.
Okay. Well, certainly more retail at this location is good for the neighborhood, so I'll be very interested to see what the community board has to say.
The community board actually saw an earlier version of this in April, the draft, but we'll be sending out the full actual application following this. And they supported it.
Oh, interesting. Okay. Thank you.
Ms. Efron.
A comment and a question. The comment is, it seems massively, slightly out of scale. I know we're here to talk about the plaza, but the 2 floors that are behind the plaza that we are here to talk about look awfully muscular compared to what else is in that neighborhood. That's just a comment. And then an observation and a question, which is that quite a few of the restaurants seem to be 24 hours. I don't know what the current POPs regulations are about 24-hour access. There is no fencing in the picture. Is that something we could just confirm that, in fact, there would be 24-hour access and visual access 24 hours, so that the stroll up and down that really beautiful promenade would be one that people would be able to enjoy?
So the plaza itself would be accessible at all times. I think it depends on what commercial the developer is able to attract, but the idea is that perhaps along this area there might be some sort of separation, but along the entire plaza itself that would be open.
Be codified through restrictive declarations.
Yes, including fencing versus no fencing.
So they could not put fencing around the plaza itself?
No. It would be perhaps with the open air cafe that they're providing for the retail.
Mr. Cantor, then Mr. Dweck.
Thank you. Do we know how they propose to handle the water situation in the cellar of the retail?
To clarify, while it is a cellar, the actual space isn't below grade. The situation here.
Cellar is 50% or less below grade.
So because this area is in the flood zone, we're not measuring from the ground, we're measuring from the flood-resistant construction elevation. That becomes the new measurement from height. And in this case, the FRCE is around 6 feet above grade. So in this situation, a space that's at grade and is the ground floor can technically be a cellar because half of it is below the FRCE, not below grade.
Will the slab at grade be subject to flooding?
Correct.
What will they be doing?
So for the ground floor in the area that's below the FRCE, what they're proposing is installing deployable flood shields. So when we know that a storm would occur, they would install these gates that kind of just slide in. And then for the residential lobby that's also at grade, that area would be wet flood proof, so the water could kind of just go in and come out.
And the elevatoring?
For the residential.
For the residential, if that was...
If the floor is going to be flooded and it can go in and come out, I assume you mean it can go into the lobby and come out from the lobby?
Correct.
What about the elevatoring? How are they keeping the community, how do they keep allowing the unit owners to exit or enter during the flood?
We can find out.
How many floors is it altogether, Daphne,
It's
the residential?
7 stories.
So conceivably, the elevator could be out during flooding and they'd have to walk. But we'll find out about the elevator. Mrs. Wack.
Just a question. Do you know the allocation of parking between the commercial and the residential?
Yes. So for the R5 C22 overlay, they'd need to require 130 parking spaces, 50 for the residential and 80 for the commercial. And in total, they're providing 134. So 4 extra parking spaces.
50 for the residential. And you know how many are going to be on the roof of on the second floor area? Not on top of the roof.
Right. I can look into the breakdown. I think the vast majority is actually going to be in the portion that's glazed. But there will be some parking on the second roof.
Yeah. Thank you.
Any other questions for Daphne on this? Thank you, Daphne.
Thank you.
So this is referred out to the community board for 45 days. We'll see you back here.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Good presentation.
Let's now move to item number 4, page 34, to Brooklyn pre-hearing application with respect to expanding the boundaries of the Metro Tech bid. Now, our presenter is Barry Dinnerstein, who's Deputy Director of Housing, Economic, and Infrastructure Planning. We're on item number 4, page 34, Brooklyn pre-hearing, Metro Tech bid, amended district plan.
Good afternoon. This is an application from the Department of Small Business Services to extend the existing MetroTech area bid south to cover 10 blocks, 10 new blocks, centered around the Brooklyn Academy of Music in downtown Brooklyn. The enlarged existing bid would provide maintenance and advocacy services for this area that's known as the Downtown Brooklyn Cultural District. The MetroTech bid was originally established in 1991, and its main focus at creation was to service the MetroTech office development, as well as blocks surrounding it. In 2004, the Commission approved a new plan for downtown Brooklyn, and that plan created a series of zoning map and zoning text amendments, new public open space, pedestrian and transit improvements for downtown Brooklyn. One provision of the plan was to create a cultural district centered around the Brooklyn Academy of Music. The plan's components included new performance and rehearsal space, office space for diverse groups of local arts organizations, public plazas, a library, a cinema, and housing. Most of the developments are presently underway, and the extension of the existing MetroTech bid to this new area is requested by property owners, cultural groups, and by the city. The existing MetroTech bid, which is this area to the north shown in blue, has a budget of about $2.6 million. It's one of 8 business improvement district and special assessment districts that operate in downtown Brooklyn. 3 of the bids, special assessment districts, are operated by the Downtown Brooklyn Partnership. Those include the MetroTech bid, the Fort Livingston bid, and the Fulton Mall Special Assessment District. I will point out that within a few weeks, we will also be seeing an application by the FAB Alliance, which is a Fulton Area Business Alliance, what FAB stands for, which covers Fulton Street, and they are proposing to extend their bid to cover 4 properties at the edge of the MetroTech, proposed MetroTech bid. One block within the proposed bid is in a historic district. That's the Brooklyn Academy of Music Historic District. That one block is where the Brooklyn Academy of Music is. It's also a block that contains One Hanson Plaza, which is the One Hanson Place, which is the former Williamsburg Savings Bank building. The area for the proposed bid expansion contains approximately 73 retailers, including 41 in the Atlantic Center Mall. Retail rents are as high as $100 to $125 per foot, and there are minimal vacancies. Some of the stores in the Atlantic Center Mall have some of the highest grossing stores for their chains in the country. There are also a number of office spaces in the district with office tenants including the Bank of New York Mellon, HSBC Bank, and others. Rents average between $35 and $40 per foot. There's also a conversion of a mini storage facility that is located at 41 Flatbush Avenue. That building is being converted to office space. It's about 250,000 square feet of what will be new office space in downtown Brooklyn. The district will also have 12 small buildings that have ground floor retail with residential above, kind of your common sort of store with 1 or 2 units above, maybe 2 or 3 floors that's found in the city. And then there are 34 small commercial buildings that are occupied solely by either retail tenants or community facility tenants. So the newly expanded bid would be 2 sub-areas. Each sub-area would have their own budget and assessment formula. The existing bid will become the north sub-area with the budget in the first year of about $2.6 million. The new bid expansion area would be the south sub-area with a budget of about $553,000 in the first year. The south sub-area budget could rise to $1 million after the 5th year, and that's as a result of new development planned or already under construction in the district. At that point, the total budget would be $3.6 million. In the first year, it's anticipated that the budget for the combined areas would be $3.1 million. The bid will also receive revenue that has been given to it by the city to maintain public plazas in the district. It's about $208,000 per year. And there will also be a small voluntary contribution from the various cultural organizations who normally do not have to contribute to the bid, and they're projecting to give a voluntary contribution of about $10,000 per year. The existing bid, which will become the north sub-area, has a complex formula in terms of assessing property, which assesses the Metro Tech office buildings at a different rate than other property in the district. The new South Sub-District will assess all property at a rate of approximately 23 cents per $100 of value. In both sub-areas, a residential property will be fully assessed, paying the same rate as commercial. The South Sub-area contains a mix of building types. There are 4 large mixed rental and commercial complexes, one of which is complete, 3 of which are under construction. And they contain about 1,300 units in total. The average assessment for these kinds of properties will be about $38,000 per year. There are 12 small mixed-use properties which contain 35 residential units, 18 ground floor commercial, and 18 ground floor commercial spaces. Projected average assessment for these properties is about $489 per year. There are 6 large commercial properties, including the Atlantic Center Mall. The average assessment per property is about $54,000 per year. There are 34 small commercial properties with projected average assessment of about $1,388 per year. There are 248 residentially owner-occupied units, generally condo units. It is projected that those owners will pay about $118 per year on average. The South Sub-District, with a projected budget of about $553,000, is projecting in its first year to spend about $165,000 for sanitation, $58,000 for landscaping, $47,000 for maintenance, $40,000 for programming, and about $241,000 for general administration and for reserve. There are 4 public plazas in the district. 2 of the plazas, Fox Square and Arts Plaza, are complete. 2 other plazas, South Site Plaza, which could use a better name, and Times Plaza, are in design or in construction. The bid will maintain these plazas using bid funds as well as funds that were transferred from the city as a result of a fund that was established dedicated for eventual plaza maintenance, and that money came from former parking lot revenues. Cultural groups in the area will help program the plazas as an in-kind contribution. When the Metro Tech bid was established in the early 90s, the area had few residents. The bid assessment was created anticipating all of its funds would be received from commercial property. Since the bid was established, there are approximately 3,400 residential units in the district. The newly proposed South Sub-area has about 600 occupied units today, with 700 more planned and under construction. There are additional properties that are also expected to result in new residential units. All residential property in the district pay the full bid assessment. Most bids do not assess residential property or have residents pay a reduced rate. The assessment formula proposed by the bid results in smaller, older properties, usually with ground floor commercial spaces, paying a very modest assessment. Large residential commercial properties will pay a substantial assessment. Most of the new residential properties are in buildings that are rental and are subject to rent stabilization. Rent stabilization does not allow for the passing through of assessment to tenants. There are 248 condo units in the South Sub-area. Each residential owner will be required to directly pay a surcharge on their property tax bill for the bid assessment. Commercial property owners have overwhelmingly supported the bid, with 90% of the assessed value signing ballots in favor of the district. Commercial tenants have not responded to requests for support, with only 15% of the businesses responding in favor. No businesses responded negatively. Residential property owners also failed to significantly respond to requests to express an opinion about the bid. Only 10% of the 283 owners responded in favor of the bid. only 1% responded negatively. And I will say that there was a very strong effort to try and get residential tenants to sign ballots in support. A number of meetings were held with condo associations. Those condo associations were generally very favorable, but when it came down to getting them to sign something saying we support the Downtown Brooklyn Partnership, the sponsor was not successful. To make sure that the needs of the residents are looked after by the bid has agreed to establish a residency advisory committee. The Downtown Brooklyn Partnership envisions this committee meeting regularly prior to bid board meetings, and the group would be able to bring to the attention of the bid board issues and concerns about the neighborhood and the operation of the bid. Community Board 2 voted 31 in favor, 1 against, and 2 abstained.
Thank you, Barry. Questions? Ms. Efron.
Hi. I realize it's a cultural district, and therefore there are going to be a lot of nonprofits in the area, but some of them have really substantial budgets. If the total expected annual income from all the nonprofits there, and I can rattle off 6 in my head, are $10,000, that strikes me as extremely low, considering the benefit that they receive. I realize it's voluntary.
I find it very exciting that they're voluntarily giving money at all.
Because they're not taxable.
I'm actually equally concerned about precedent moving forward, that nonprofits, despite our love for them, feel some responsibility for participating as community members within a bid situation. That's all.
Well, because they're nonprofit and not taxable, they don't pay, and that's the legislation. And so whatever they pay is what they pay. And,
right. I would imagine a negotiated payment in lieu of tax would be really an interesting idea going forward.
That's what it is.
Well, just in response to that, I would say, I mean, my reaction is similar to Mr. Cirillo's, but I do agree. I mean, as a general proposition, I do agree that since the not-for-profits are among the chief, in any bid, I'm not referring to this one particularly, I'll use the meatpacking example as a meatpacking district as another example of one of the major reasons for the meatpacking bid was the creation, was development of the Whitney, which is providing a tremendous excitement, but also additional burdens on the meatpacking district, and also a very well-endowed institution. And in other cities, not-for-profits do contribute to the bids, especially in these circumstances. Not required by law, obviously, but I know Mr. Cirillo has got a lot of experience in this area, and I dare say that in other cities, Philadelphia particularly, not-for-profits do make a significant contribution.
And a lot of time is spent by us in helping to market and have an experience for those who are visiting the not-for-profits. I mean, there's a variety of the cultural institutions versus a not-for-profit office space, which has a different impact. We have non-tax, tax exempt government buildings that provide huge services in the neighborhood, consulates and other, and not just city government, which of course Grand Central in the middle of the neighborhood, but where we have literally thousands of people who show up to register for things to get benefits, to understand what's going on. Those are the areas where we have to increase services, and there's no contribution. So this is definitely not enough, but the fact that they're stepping up and given the purpose of this, I think it's the right message to send, whether or not it's a non-for citywide issue, and look at this, it's a whole other issue, obviously being quite controversial at some level, but you raise a very interesting point, which I appreciate.
Clearly not required by the statute.
With regard to affordability, is that pursuant to statute, or is it just more philanthropic?
So it is an arts district, and there is an arts district along Avenue of the Arts, I believe, and there is a payment unit taxes that has been negotiated, and it's fairly substantial, our contribution is substantial.
It's a
Payment unit tax, yeah.
payment of assessment, or payment of
Yeah, or assessment.
payment of assessment, but negotiated.
Yeah. And you know,
Go right ahead.
I would agree that that's something that I was going to raise as well. It's clearly a cultural district, and it was intended to be originally. You know, my question is, you know, what, perhaps this is a, you know, an argument to make to the cultural institutions. I wonder what percent of the district is dedicated to cultural uses. They're clearly not incorporated in the assessed value, right? But they make up a major element of, you know, the streetscape and the frontage.
I don't know in terms of Florida how much they make up, but they certainly are the reason why people would want to be here.
Yes, and I think, you know, we should really encourage them to be good neighbors here and contribute much more than this $10,000, given that they will benefit significantly, and this is the purpose of the district. I had another question with respect to the budget. It seems that I'm a little confused as to the budget numbers here. So the 553 is what's coming from the assessment. Then there's, you know, this 10,000 that's coming from cultural institutions, and then something, an additional 200 that's coming from public plaza funds. Could you explain the public plaza funds?
There was money, you know, these were all parking lots, and there was revenue that came from the parking lots, which I believe was put into escrow. And so the money has been held by EDC, and now will go to the bid for use in terms of maintenance of Plaza. And I think there's about 7 years' worth of funding there. It's a little unclear what happens at the end of year 7, but they have a good amount of money in the first few years to get these plazas up and operating, and then after that, maybe the cultural groups will have to kick in more money.
Okay, so it's not in perpetuity.
No.
Unlike the assessment. Okay.
Right.
And then another question with respect to the what's set aside for general administration and reserve. I did a quick calculation. I think it's about 45% that's going for general administration. How does that compare to other bids, and is that high or low? I mean, it gets back to sort of the question I continue to have. It's very difficult to understand this in the absence of metrics that allow us to compare apples to apples.
You know, I think for a bid this size, it's somewhat typical. There's a lot of programming here that is going to be done by staff. So on some level, it is administrative, but on some level, it's actually sort of doing things in terms of the programming of the plazas, doing events. So it's not exactly administration in the sense of some of the other bids, but some of the other bids which are you know, much more just straight maintenance of the various services that the bids provide.
Yeah, I would love to see, we talked about this, or Staten Island also, you know, some sort of way to be able to compare budgets, apples to apples by, you know, linear frontage or, you know, total square footage in the district, so that we can make better, you know, a more clear determination as to whether the funds are sufficient to do what they need, and then to be able to turn around to cultural institutions, and if that's part of the strategy, say we need something more from you, because compared to other similar districts, we are, you know, we have an anemic budget or whatever.
Okay, I mean, we can talk to the small business owners.
I think that some of those metrics, SBS has comparing bids to bid, one bid to another, not all of them. But to the extent that SBS has them, and I believe some of that information has been made public, particularly administrative costs to operating costs and the like.
Absolutely.
That, I'm sure we can provide that. Ms. Levin, then Ms. Efron, and then Ms.
Yes, Barry, I have two questions. One is, as you indicated, it's quite unusual for residential properties to be included in the assessment, and I'm curious about the history here and why that is the case and what that says about bids in general. And my second question is about, there is a condition in the community board's letter, which is they want a seat back on the board. Is there some history there, and are they going to get their seat? Community boards are normally represented on bid boards. What's the story?
Okay, so the first question about the assessment on residents. When the bid was established in 1991, there really were no substantial residential property in the district. It was really a commercial district. There might have been one residential building in the entire district, all residential. The rest of the residential that was there were basically commercial on the ground floor with 2 units above. So, residential was not really an issue, and mixed buildings such as we now have in downtown Brooklyn was not really an issue. So the way the formula was written, it basically just said total assessed value. And then suddenly we got thousands of units of residential, and so suddenly they were picked up by the formula. And this is being now continued in the South using the same sort of mechanism.
So it's just an accident of history that we're not going to correct?
At this point, there was no interest in sort of trying to change the formula.
Thank you.
I can let on Wednesday, the Downtown Brooklyn Partnership can sort of explain what sort of happened with the community board, but I think there was kind of a feeling on the part of the board, and it wasn't just in terms of the community board, it was, they felt that there was meddling going on. I have no idea meddling about what, but there was meddling, and they decided they just wanted to throw everybody off the board, which they could not do. So the bid has put the community board back on. They've agreed to make sure the community board is represented, and the community board has also said that their representative will be a residential tenant who lives in the district, so it will be one that represents the community board, but they also represent residential tenants, and that's in addition to the one residential tenant that must be on the board by statute.
Okay, so that issue's on its way to being addressed.
There's a lot of interest in this. Ms. Efron, Ms. Deluz, then Mr. Cirillo, and then Ms. Ortiz.
I think there's a lot of interest because there seem to be bigger and more bids, and I think it's probably useful to air some of these questions. If, in fact, there's any income from activities, whether it's a TKTS booth or something else particular to a cultural district, does that money then it goes into the general coffers, correct, and reduces the amount?
General bid coffers?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
I think, for the most part, they are compensated, like if it's a city event or something like that, they are compensated for the service. And yes, it goes into their budget. In theory, they could reduce their assessment if they wanted to reduce services.
Okay. I suppose I can find this out for general bid law, but it's kind of an interesting question. Thank you.
In general, it just increases revenue, does not... I've yet to see a bid, including the one I was involved in, actually providing a rebate. So,
or a reduction the following year.
Ms. Deluz.
Barry, this is mostly just in preparation for Wednesday's hearing. I know that there was a lot of discussion at the neighborhood level about which blocks to include, which ones not. Obviously, this is across the street from Barclays. And the Atlantic Yards project, and that has its own set of impacts on the proposed area. So I would just hope that on Wednesday we could hear a little bit more about how that will be handled moving forward.
In terms of their boundaries?
Mr. Cirillo.
Oh, okay. I guess Barry, you just referenced, just to understand, in addition to the committee that the bid has agreed to establish for the residential component, there will be a residential board member, at least one.
Yes.
Which is typical, right? So.
Well, they're required to have a residential tenant on the board.
At least one. I mean, they could elect 10 if they wanted to.
That's correct.
Right? Okay. So I just wanted to make sure that that's clear, because the residents do have an opportunity through the election process on the board to have, in addition to the community board, which I'm glad they've corrected that situation, and now this committee, which will focus specifically on the concerns of the residential population.
Right.
They will also have an elected director on the board, at least one, which is good. Just two thoughts that come out of this discussion. Historically, there was no distinction between residential owners and commercial owners. As someone who has an older bid, there is no distinction between a commercial property owner or a residential owner. It's an owner of real estate. And so if you are in the Grand Central district and you own a condo, you are assessed with what the board, has chosen to provide as the assessment, with the support, obviously, the legislative process that the city follows to do that. So the trend was later. I mean, the history was there was no distinction, basically. And then the trend was later, which I think was more previous administration, which focused intently. I think for us, the issue we need to spend time thinking about, as mixed-use neighborhoods become the reality, and that's a positive thing for the business community and for residents, that we have neighborhoods that are more 24/7, which is what a bid strives to do, even in a core commercial district, is to create an environment where there's something happening and your retailers have shoppers and diners and everything else that's happening. That we need to recognize that perhaps that chapter of trend is not really the future, and as so long as there are protections involved and there's a seat at the table or more than one seat for people to have the discussions that are important to them. And so I just throw that out there as a thought. And
yeah, I hadn't realized it was so bounded by time.
Correct. And I mean, and I think in fairness, although I know the math, this is all very average, but when you look at the fact that $118 per year, which is, it's $10 a month, to have the benefits of sort of this 7-day-a-week operation in your neighborhood is actually not a lot to ask, although I realize nobody ever wants to pay more for anything they think they should be getting anyway, which is always the bid's fight. And the last thing I would say about the increase, we'll call it surplus revenue, is that the positive aspect of that, and that also helps to create an incentive from a managerial point of view to manage a budget correctly, is that it is important for bids to amass at some degree some reserve. And it's not only a best practice that the city controller encourages, the mayor, our elected representatives on our board, which is also important to remember, that the borough president, the controller, the mayor, and the council member are all members of the board and help to, sort of keep the checks and balances if, hopefully it's not necessary, but when it is, it's important to have it. That it does help to create some bank account for emergency circumstances and other, operational issues that may come up. So, I mean, I think this is very well thought out, and, hopefully the community feels the same. So, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Ms. Ortiz.
Hi. So are cultural institutions, I understand, I should say, that sometimes issues of governance, the details are dealt with a little later, but, has there been any thought given to how cultural institutions will participate in governance at this stage?
I'm not aware of it, but you can ask on Wednesday.
Okay, great. And will there be, do you know if any of the cultural institutions will be here at the hearing?
It will be.
Right.
Ask him directly.
I have a few questions,
Based on-
Barry, and also just, this is a commission that is highly knowledgeable about the subject of bids. But our role is, in this process is somewhat constrained and limited to, with respect to the land use implications of the creation of the bid, and also the fairness of and full disclosure of the process, so that everyone is aware of a bit of what's going on. So with respect to the latter, Barry, you indicated the response rate on commercial and residential owners and occupants in the bid. Is the response rate among commercial and residential owners fairly typical? Is it atypical in terms of your prior experience?
I think it's on the lower side. Again, I think a lot of effort went into trying to search these folks out and trying to get them to respond. And there was very little sort of negative feedback on it. There was a good deal of positive feedback, although folks, were not willing to sign things. Some of it is because they are, they can't sign something because it's a corporation. They have to go to corporate to get permission. It's a little unclear. I think there's a certain amount of sort of general indifference, which is not always the best situation, but I think in a neighborhood bid, people sometimes can be a lot more engaged because they're much more tied into the neighborhood as opposed to being in sort of a downtown environment. But they certainly had very strong property owners. And I guess the partnership can talk more about the outreach.
Well, to be candid, it's easy to get the property owner support because ultimately...
Not always.
Not always, but usually because they're not the ones who ultimately have to pay. And I realize here, for all the reasons that Mr. Cirillo indicated, we haven't gotten too many applications with residents who have been asked to pay. But with respect to commercial tenants, is the response rate fairly typical, low, high, or average?
Again, I think it would be on the low side.
Then my second question is, with respect to board representation, is there are two different sub-areas here, each with differentiated services and to some extent differentiated purposes. Will the sub-area, the new sub-area, sub-area B, is that sub-area B?
South sub-area.
South sub-area, will that have proportional representation on the board?
Yes.
Thank you. Okay. Any other questions? Interesting hearing on Wednesday.
Let's now advance to item number 5, page 52, proposed urban development action area project designation, project approval to facilitate adaptive reuse of an existing community facility building at 269 Henry Street. Our presenter is Joel from the Manhattan office. Manhattan pre-hearing, item number 5, page 52.
Good afternoon, Chairman. Good afternoon, Commissioners. So this application is returning as a pre-hearing item after review by Manhattan Community Board 3. It's an application by the Department of Housing Preservation and Development for approval of an urban development action area project designation and project approval of city-owned property located at 269 Henry Street. Approval of the requested actions will facilitate the rehabilitation and conversion of an existing former firehouse to a community facility building in the Lower East Side of Manhattan Community Board 3. 269 Henry Street is located on the north side of Henry Street between Grand Street to the east and Montgomery Street to the west. The site's improved the 4-story former firehouse building that was operated by the New York City Fire Department, and that building's right here. So in April 2007, the City Council approved an application for disposition of 269 Henry Street. During the public review process, Community Board 3 and the Manhattan Community Board President did not support the unrestricted disposition of the property. And so therefore, that 2007 approval included a restriction that the property be used as a community facility. So subsequent to the approval, a steering committee was created that included the Manhattan Borough President, the Community Board, City Hall, various city agencies, and this was to identify an end user for the site, and ultimately the Lower East Side nonprofit Henry Street Settlement was selected. So as part of the proposed project, the existing firehouse will be rehabilitated and converted to this community facility. The rehabilitation will not add any additional density or height to the existing building. The new community facility will provide a neighborhood resource center operated by Henry Street Settlement, and services on site will include crisis intervention, financial counseling, legal services, and access to benefits including free or low-cost health insurance, public assistance, food stamps, and Social Security. On May 26, 2015, the Manhattan Community Board 3 passed a resolution recommending approval of the proposed project, which again seeks approval of an urban development action area project designation and project approval of city-owned property at 269 Henry Street. So the public hearing is on Wednesday, and HPD will be here to present in addition to Henry Street Settlement.
Questions for Joel? This is the first time you've appeared before us with no questions.
That's great.
I can remember.
Thank you.
He's earned it. Let's now move to item number 6, page 75, for Bronx rehearing application with respect to a series of land use actions, zoning map and zoning text amendment, special permit, authorization and a mod to an existing restrictive deck to facilitate over 175 affordable housing units for seniors and disabled individuals in the Mott Haven neighborhood of the Bronx. Paul Phillips from the Bronx office will be presenting. We're on item number 6, page 75, Bronx pre-hearing application.
Good afternoon, Chair Weisbrod, Commissioners. This item is before us for pre-hearing review. The applicant, the Westside Federation for Senior and Supportive Housing, is seeking the approval of 5 actions. The first is a zoning map change from R6 to R72 with C14 and C24 overlays, and R6 to R6 with C14 commercial overlays. The second is a zoning text amendment to permit a reduction in required parking for residential uses. The third is a special permit pursuant to section 74743 to permit the location of buildings without regard to applicable yards, courts, distance between buildings, heights, and also setback regulations. The third is also a special permit pursuant to 74745 to waive the number of required off-street accessory parking spaces. And the fifth action is an authorization to permit a reduction of required bicycle parking spaces. Together, these actions would facilitate the development of 178 income-restricted housing units for seniors within the Mott Haven section of Bronx Community Board 1. On April 29th, 2015, Community Board 1 held a public hearing on this item and voted 29 in favor, 0 opposed, and 0 abstaining. The Borough President also held a public hearing on this item on May 15th and voted to approve this application.
Thank you, Paul. Questions? Any questions? Thank you.
See you Wednesday. Thank you.
Let's now move to item number 7, page 163, proposed zoning text amendment to permit community facility use within the Queens Plaza sub-district of the Special Long Island City District. Our presenter is Penny Lee, planner in the Queens office. We're on item number 7, page 153, Queens pre-hearing.
It's a damn good idea.
Good afternoon. This is the application by Bright Horizons to modify the Queens Plaza subdistrict text provisions to allow community facility uses on 4 blocks at Queens Plaza where the ground floor use had previously been restricted to just commercial. Bright Horizons filed the application to facilitate their construction of a daycare facility on Block 420, located at the corner of Queens Plaza South and Jackson Avenue. The majority of their site, the community facility use would be allowed as of right. There's this small portion outlined in red that is subject to the community facility use restriction. This application affects sites in both Community Boards 1 and 2 in Queens. Community Board 1 at their May meeting recommended in favor of the application, 42 in favor, 0 opposed, and 0 abstentions. And Community Board 2, by a show of hands at their June 4th meeting, unanimously recommended in favor of the application. The Borough President is having her Borough Board meeting tonight, and they are hopeful that they will have a quorum, and then they will be able to send in their application or their recommendation by Wednesday.
Questions for Penny? Ms. Ortiz.
Hi, how are you? Earlier when this came up for certification, there were some issues raised and concerns related to sound attenuation, pollution, concerns about drop-off and pick-up, because it's a very, very busy intersection. I'm curious, sort of, have there been any changes or reflections on the plan as a result? I mean, you mentioned something about the windows at the time. I mean, could you speak to?
Well, they're required to, there's an E designation on the property specific to noise. So they will be required to put in the required window wall attenuation to meet DEP's requirements to keep it quiet. So that goes without saying.
But those requirements don't reflect the heightened issues of sound at this particular location.
Yes, they do.
Okay.
Yes, they do.
Okay.
That was done at the time the property was rezoned in 2001. And when we talked to DEP and the Mayor's Office of Environmental Coordination, they were quite specific that while the office building the office portion of the building wasn't required to do any specific window wall attenuation, the fit out of the space for Bright Horizons has to provide, I forget the exact DBA, but it will be specific to children in a building.
Okay, that's helpful.
And in terms of the traffic and drop-off, the applicant will be here on Wednesday, as well as the operator from Bright Horizons, so they can speak more specifically. But there is on 28th Street, which is a fairly wide street, the entrance is on 28th Street, so there's an opportunity for drop-off here.
Okay.
And then there's also an entrance to the subway station right about here. So you would come here, or you would come here and drop off the children. And then there's a bus stop, one block to the west, and there's also a bus stop just right around the corner.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Ms. Levin.
Yes, Penny, I have a question about the potential for community facility use on not the Bright Horizons portion that's affected, but the other blocks. Because you had mentioned, I guess I'd asked it when we referred this out, why there was that limitation, and you had said at the time you were hoping for, sort of jazzier street level activity.
Right.
In fact, I think the Bright Horizons build out, which looks like it's mostly complete, is going to fulfill that because they have, the windows are fully transparent. You're going to see a lot of activity. It's going to fulfill what you were hoping for. But we all know that community facility use might not get built out there that way. Are there transparency requirements in the text
yes.
so that we can, even if we do end up with community facility uses on those other sites, they will be similarly active?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, it's at least 50% transparent. It's the standard transparency requirement that's in effect in high-density commercial areas.
Excellent.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Any other questions? Okay, thanks, Penny.
Let's now go to item number 8, page 193, proposed disposition of city-owned property, acquisition of property, and modification to a previously approved special permit to facilitate mixed-use development, including the Brooklyn Heights Library.
Chair, just note for the record, I have to recuse myself.
Noted.
May have to.
And Mr. Dweck as well is recused on this item.
The record will so note. And our presenter is Alex Summers from the Trustee.
Did you?
I don't benefit, so.
I know. Did you seen the exchange about Sharon?
Thank you. Good afternoon, Chairman and Commissioners. This is an application by the New York City Department of Citywide Administrative Services, the Brooklyn Public Library, and Hudson Companies seeking the disposition of city-owned land, acquisition of a condominium unit in the proposed new development, and the modification of a previously approved Vulcan Heights special permit. These actions would facilitate a new mixed-use development, including approximately 21,500 square foot public library and approximately 280,000 square feet of residential, retail, and community facility space in downtown Brooklyn Community District 2. The proposed site is map C64 as well as the surrounding blocks, and it's also located within the special district downtown Brooklyn. The zoning allows high-density commercial, residential, and community facility development of between 10 to 12 FAR, depending on participation in the Inclusionary Housing program or providing urban design bonuses such as plazas or arcades. C64 tower regulations require a setback of between 10 and 15 feet after a height of 85 feet, and there are no maximum building heights. The proposed project site is located on the border of the predominantly residential Brooklyn Heights neighborhood to the west, and downtown Brooklyn, the borough's central business district, to the south and the east. As well, to the east and then running north is a large swath of public parkland connecting downtown Brooklyn to Dumbo and the East River waterfront and Brooklyn Bridge Park. The surrounding area is mapped R8, which has a max FAR of 6.02 and scattered C15 commercial overlays. These consist generally of height factor residential towers, with scattered retail, the buildings rising between 35 and 280 feet in height. Immediately adjacent to the proposed project site along Clinton Street, residential and community facilities rise between 80 and 140 feet in height. Blocks further west are mapped R71 with a max FAR of 3.44, but that area generally falls within a limited height district, LH1, which caps building heights to 50 feet. The Brooklyn Heights Historic District is designated over the vast majority of Brooklyn Heights to the west. The Borough Hall Historic Skyscraper District is also just south of this site. The immediate area is well served by transit, including access to the subway lines at the Clark Street 2-3, Borough Hall 2-3-4-5, and the Court Street N and R lines, and these are all within 2 to 3 blocks of the site. As well, multiple bus routes run along Cabin Plaza West and Adams Street. The proposed project site, Block 239, lots 1, 3, and 16, are currently improved with 3 buildings. Lot 1 consists of 1 Pierre Pont Plaza, a 19-story, 320-foot tall, approximately 600,000 square foot commercial office building. Lot 3 consists of St. Anne's Private School. It's a 6-story, 85-foot high, 23,000 square foot school building. And Lot 16, which is the proposed development site, consisting of a 2-story Brooklyn Heights Branch Public Library. The existing library contains both a branch library and a business and career library within approximately 28,600 square feet of usable space. There is an additional approximately 29,400 square feet of unusable space, which includes a former fallout shelter, which is inaccessible to the public, as well as mechanical and storage space for uncatalogued books and old supplies. The Brooklyn Public Library has stated it plans to relocate the business and career branch to the central library at Grand Army Plaza, regardless of whether the proposed development occurs. The existing facility has also unfunded capital needs of more than $9.2 million, including a non-functioning HVAC system, which has forced the library to operate on reduced hours during summer months. The applicants are now proposing to redevelop the Brooklyn Heights Branch Library with a new mixed-use building, and that's the gray area on this slide here. The proposed building is a 36-story, approximately 415-foot high development consisting of approximately 294,900 square feet. It includes space for a new Brooklyn Heights Branch Library, as well as ground floor retail and community facility space, and approximately 139 market rate dwelling units. The new library would be located within a city-owned condominium at the ground floor of the building, accessible from Cadman Plaza West, and total approximately 21,500 square feet. And this includes a mezzanine space for additional reading rooms and cellar space for additional stacks and presentations. And that's cellar space. In addition, approximately 153,000 square feet is being generated by 114 off-site affordable units pursuant to the zoning resolution 23-90. These are proposed in 2 new mixed-use buildings located in Clinton Hill within Community District 2, and these are currently mapped R7A C24. The applicants are proposing the following AMI breakdowns for these buildings. 20 units at less than 60% of AMI, 61 units at less than 80% of AMI, 6 units at less than 100% of AMI, and 24 units at less than 165% of AMI. In order to facilitate the proposed development, the applicants are requesting 3 actions: disposition, acquisition, and modification of a previously approved special permit. DCAS and Brooklyn Public Library intend to dispose of the 26,620 square foot Lot 16 to Hudson Companies for the proposed redevelopment. During the redevelopment of the site, the applicants are proposing to relocate the library to facilitate continuous service during construction. The temporary facility would be located at 113 Remsen Street, approximately 2.5 blocks from the library's existing location. The space would be used as it's currently used as a social hall, 7,500 square feet, owned by Our Lady of Lebanon Church. Once the development of the proposed building is complete, the city would acquire a condo within the base of the building, again totaling approximately 21,500 square feet, spread throughout the ground floor, a mezzanine, and cellar space. Part of the space would include an auditorium, adult reading room, teen lounge, and children's reading room. It is anticipated that the branch library will have a staff of 10 and serve approximately 200 to 300,000 patrons annually. The condo will also include 2 dedicated parking spaces in the below-grade parking garage. The branch library is anticipated to operate between 10 a.m. to 6 p.m. Monday and Friday, 10 a.m. to 8 p.m. Tuesday to Saturday, and 10 a.m. To 5 p.m. on Sundays. The final action is a modification of a previously approved special permit, 860392 ZSK. In 1985, the City Planning Commission granted a height and setback special permit pursuant to 74-721 to a then proposed 1 Pierre-Pont Plaza, whose zoning lot included both Lot 1, Pierre-Pont Plaza, as well as the library site, Lot 16. The special permit was subsequently modified, then refiled and approved in 1986. The modified waivers included an increase in the height of the building from 375 feet to 397 feet, a reduction in building setbacks, and an increase in total floor area from nearly 592,000 square feet to about 601,000 square feet. These changes were to increase access to light and air along Clinton and Pierre-Pont streets. Because the proposed 1 Clinton redevelopment is located on a zoning lot, which includes 1 Pierre-Pont Plaza, the previously approved special permit must be modified to reflect the proposed development. This includes the alteration to the zoning lot and slight design changes to existing open areas on the zoning lot. You should also take note that due to tower regulations created under the 2004 downtown Brooklyn rezoning, 1 Pierre-Pont's need for waivers have been significantly reduced, and 1 Clinton's proposed tower would be considering as of right outside of these actions. In conclusion, these actions would facilitate the redevelopment of a 2-story public library into a 295,000 square foot mixed-use development, a new 21,500 square foot library, and 114 off-site affordable housing units. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex. Questions? Mr. Knuckles.
The record indicates that the current library, which may well be inefficient, but has approximately 28,600 square feet of usable space versus the 21,500 square feet that is proposed for the new facility.
The difference between the two is it's currently occupied by both a branch library as well as the business and career library. And the
Right.
business and career library is actually moving off-site regardless of the actions.
Mhm.
And so that's part of the discrepancy in the total square footage size.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Ms. Levin?
Ms. Alex, I'd like to ask about the two off-site the affordable housing sites. Are those currently controlled by the applicant?
I know for a fact one is. I believe they're in negotiations on the other site, and I'll have them respond.
Okay, so the plan is that they will acquire, and
Yes.
then, will they be the developers, or?
Yes. And the same architect for both this building as well as those buildings.
Okay, and I understand that one of those sites does have some residential units that are occupied?
Yes, I believe so.
And I'm sure we'll hear about it in the course of the process, but I'm curious about what the fate of those tenants will
Understood.
be.
I'll follow up.
Okay.
Ms. Efron?
Has the FAR transfer with the school taken place? Is that already negotiated?
I believe it's been negotiated, but the official zoning lot merger has not yet occurred.
Right. So, thanks.
Any other questions? Thanks.
Thanks, Alex. I guess we'll ask Commissioner De La Ruz and Dweck to return. Let's now go to item number 9. It's a post-hearing follow-up for the actions associated with the Staten Island Mall enlargement. And our presenter is Barry Fisher of the Staten Island office.
Good afternoon, Chairman and Commissioners. The applicant, General Growth Properties, along with co-applicants Macy's and JCPenney, request CPC authorizations for layout of parking, reduction in parking requirement, and modifications of landscaping requirements within a C41 zoning district. These actions would facilitate the proposed enlargement of the existing Staten Island Mall, which you see the site plan here, located on an 85-acre site in the Heartland Village of Staten Island's Community District 2. This enlargement would be located on a portion of existing parking, replacing 1,780 parking spaces with approximately 418,000 square feet of new floor area for theater, more retail space, new eating space, a 3-level parking structure, a multi-use open plaza, additional landscaping, and improved pedestrian connections, and would result in an overall net reduction of 367 parking spaces for a new total of 5,477 parking spaces. For the requested CPC authorizations, the Commission must find that the proposed parking lot site plan provides adequate ingress and egress to abutting streets and uses. Proposed parking is sufficient for the proposed uses. Maneuverability and curb cut regulations have been complied with to the maximum extent possible. The amount of interior planting islands and their distribution throughout the parking lot have been provided to the maximum extent possible. And that perimeter and interior landscaping has been engineered to absorb stormwater runoff to the maximum extent possible. This project had been referred to Community Board 2 on March 16th, who voted recommending approval, 21 in favor, 11 against, without any comments or conditions. The applicant notes that the proposed development will result in 943 new jobs and will support a significant upgrade of a 1971-era shopping center to meet the demands and needs of today's shoppers, provides a significant new public gathering space, and represents a significant private investment in a portion of the city where the city is investing in Fresh Skills Park right across the street from Richmond Avenue. The Staten Island Mall enlargement project was the subject of a draft environmental impacts public hearing on May 6th. The DEIS identified unmitigated impacts in one or more peak hour periods at 5 intersections. Standard mitigation measures were also proposed at these intersections, as well as the other 38 of the 38 intersections where needed. But the analysis indicated that those measures would not mitigate the impacts. Since the DEIS was issued, Department of Transportation's Highway and Signal Divisions took a hard look at the mitigation analysis and had found some proposed measures involving lane reconfigurations to have safety issues, such as for trucks turning safely and for vehicles to avoid head-on collisions, and therefore concluded that the proposed mitigation measures were impractical at 8 of the intersections in which mitigation or partial mitigation was proposed in the DEIS. So the applicant now indicates or discloses that a total of 13 intersections surrounding the mall would have unmitigated impacts. And this represents the reasonable worst case scenario, which is only during the peak holiday shopping period. The applicants have agreed to perform a follow-up traffic monitoring plan within 6 months of the completion of the proposed project. The purpose of the monitoring plan is to further study the proposed mitigation measures identified in the FEIS and explore potential mitigation measures that, measures for potential impacts identified as partially mitigated or unmitigated. Now, no public comments have been received regarding the draft EIS, and so the final EIS will be issued on Friday, June 19th. In response to questions from the Commission, the applicant provided a letter which has been distributed to everybody. The applicant noted in response to a question that the pedestrian paths between Richmond Avenue, which of course has the Springville Greenway, New Springville Greenway across the street next to Fresh Kills, that the previously proposed pedestrian paths would be modified to be shared pedestrian and bike paths, allowing cyclists to enter the mall property separate from vehicular traffic. The internal ring road, which surrounds 3 sides of the mall, would be a Class 3 bike lane and be marked with arrows, shared arrows, alerting motorists and bicyclists that lanes are to be shared. This is 2 lanes in each direction currently, and would remain that way for much of its length, and 1 lane in each direction in the back. In regards to a question about sidewalks, the applicant noted that the project's sidewalks will provide a minimum 6-foot clearance, and curb cuts will be provided near all entrances and crosswalks to ensure ADA accessibility. Additionally, parking spaces will be provided in close proximity to the front and other entrances to meet ADA regulations. In response to a question about providing upgrades or new bus shelters, the applicant noted that 7 bus stops currently serve the mall. 3 of them are within the project area. 1 is outside the project area in the Sears zoning lot, and 3 are off-site in publicly owned property within the street. Of those 7 stops, 4 of them have bus shelters and 3 do not. Of the sites without the shelters, 2 of them are located on mall property, so the applicant will continue to work with MTA to develop a plan to build additional shelters, but construction and upgrading them is dependent on MTA's bus stop franchisee. The applicant will work diligently to follow up on these concerns. The question regarding whether electric charging stations would be included in the parking structure, the applicant has stated that an agreement with Volta Charging that provides charging stations at 11 of their properties on the West Coast in central U.S. will also, they're also working on a strategy with them for the East Coast properties, and the SA Mall is being considered for these stations. No decision has been made yet, but the new garage designs will not, preclude any future possibility of electric charging stations in the garage. The potential for extending the loop, the ring road that's currently 3 sides of the mall, the potential to extend it on the 4th side as a means to reduce traffic on Platinum Avenue has, the applicant has noticed that while the applicant and co-applicants do not have any control over this Sears zoning lot and cannot commit to any future design or layout of that parcel, there's nothing in the current enlargement plans that would preclude extending the loop roads being a continuous circle through the Sears property by Sears at some point in the future. So in summary, the department believes that the application has been carefully considered. Thank you.
Questions? Mr. Cantor.
You referenced that the applicant is going to have a follow-up traffic survey.
Mm-hmm.
Is it by the same consultant who did the initial traffic survey?
I don't know about that particular aspect. I would imagine that would be an option, but.
Well, the reason I asked the question is the man indicated there were certain areas that were not resolvable.
Mm-hmm.
And
right.
Is he going to come back now after a traffic survey and decide that they're going to be resolvable? You're asking him to reverse his own opinion.
Well, it's DOT that has, weighed in on the decision to not allow, if you will, mitigations at these additional 8 intersections. I think that's what you're referring to.
Yes.
What would happen after, during the monitoring plan, which would be some 6 months after it's built out, perhaps in 2018, 2019, 2020, depending on when Macy's gets finished, I believe. Is that the real world conditions may be different than what's forecast. The forecast is based on current conditions times an extrapolation of growth. So it would be a better reflection of real world conditions.
Well, that's true. Now, if the real world conditions showed work was necessary, is there any understanding as to when the work would be done after learning what the work should be?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't have
well, I think it would be impossible now to determine what would be required after.
No, that wasn't my question. I'm saying at the end of the day, when they determine what's required, is there some sort of a commitment that's time-wise to institute any changes or any modifications as a result of the survey?
No, I would think that that's an issue that would have to be addressed after the survey with both the mall and DOT, because after all, it's in the mall's interests as well as DOT's interests to address it at that time. But how they would address it, I think, will depend a lot on what they find when they do the survey. Is that fine?
Quick question. We were told several months ago that it's now a requirement of all parking garage permits to have electric charging stations. Is there not a requirement here because it's an existing parking lot, or could you just get back to me or us about why this should be outside of the scope of other parking garages, considering it's a large parking area?
Yeah, I can get into that.
We'll get back.
Thanks. A lot. Is that why there's no requirement? That's
Any other questions? Okay, thank you, Barry.
Thank you. So, moving right along, commissioners just wanted to announce that we have a request from HPD to delay the vote for PROMESA for 2 weeks until July 1st. They're having some scheduling conflicts. Trying to schedule some meetings across the street once you guys complete your deliberation. So we've been asked to push that vote back for 2 weeks. As for Wednesday, we have prepared favorable reports for the Hospital for Special Surgery, which involves a series of land use actions to facilitate its expansion. We have 41 Great Jones Street, which is a special permit to facilitate residential use. S&L Aerospace Metals, which is the disposition to facilitate expansion to an existing business in College Point, Queens. We have the proposed text amendment to support the reconstruction of Hurricane Sandy impacted areas, known as the Special Regulations for Neighborhood Recovery. We have Johnson Street, which is a special South Richmond Development District certification for zoning lot subdivision to facilitate commercial use and accessory parking. We have 57 Willis Avenue, which is a commission certification with respect to the restoration of property within the Special Hillsides Preservation District by removing lot coverage on the existing zoning lot. We also have 60 Louise Lane, which is a City Planning Commission Special Natural Area District certification involving tree planting requirements for property within the Special Natural Area District. We have 178 Foster Road, which is a special South Richmond Development District certification for future subdivision. And we have 324 Robinson Avenue, which is a proposed special South Richmond Development District zoning lot subdivision, all on for Wednesday. As for 2 weeks, July 1st, in addition to the application from HPD that was just described, we also have 520 West 28th Street, which is a special permit for accessory parking. There was a concern raised about the access into the parking garage that the applicant responded to in a letter to you that was in your package. And Ezra's just going to very briefly describe that letter.
Good afternoon. So the applicant provided a letter in response to the questions raised by the commissioners at the June 3rd public hearing, specifically about concerns relating to the operation of the entry and exit bay and the time associated with loading and unloading a vehicle prior to intake. In the letter, the applicant reviews the garage's operations, noting in particular the measures in place to maximize safety and efficiency. The applicant notes that the entry bay is located directly adjacent to the the residential portion's concierge desk. This allows the concierge to assist users with the loading and unloading of vehicles and will ensure efficient operation in the rare event that more than one vehicle is waiting to access the garage. The applicant found that with 3 similar automated facilities, there was a daily turnover of approximately 30% of vehicles. They assert that an accessory automated facility with 29 spaces, such as theirs, would therefore experience approximately 10 vehicles coming in and out per day. Therefore, they do not anticipate any backups or delays. Also following the hearing, the applicant reached out to the operator of an attended accessory parking facility with a similar target demographic and developed by the same developer. That garage with 46 spaces had a daily turnover of approximately 17% for vehicles that were on a monthly contract. According to the applicant, while Fridays and Sundays saw a few more vehicles entering and exiting than other days, there were no temporal spikes or specific times in which vehicles were stacking up. The operator also explained to the applicant that many of the units were pied-à-terres, and that very few vehicles were utilized for commuting with regular ins and outs. The applicant expects a very similar situation for the subject automated accessory garage.
Any questions? Thank you.
We also have for July 1st, 76 Greenwich Avenue, St. Vincent's Park, which involves proposed city map and zoning text amendment. We have the Melrose Commons North Site B, a series of actions to facilitate affordable housing, mixed-use development in the Melrose neighborhood of the Bronx. We have the Staten Island Mall enlargement, which was just discussed, and we will get back to the commission regarding requirements for charging stations for electric cars prior to that vote. And we have the Bank of Manhattan landmark, which is in Queens. And we have determined that there are no conflicts with the zoning resolution, projected public improvements or plans for the area involved.
Is that it, Madam Secretary?
I love that shirt.
Any other questions, comments, thoughts, or anything? And if not, we're adjourned till Wednesday. See you later.
I thought the photos of Sharon were quite nice.
They were pretty nice. They were pretty nice, given the article.
I'm seeing her on Wednesday night for dinner.
I sent her notes.